Chapter 187. Earth Elemental. Earth Elemental was divided into several subcategories. Even though Earth God's emissary was named Earth Elemental, Ekman's Earth Elemental was in fact Earth Elemental. Earth Elemental was one of the lowest elemental elements. It was extremely powerful in the early stages, but its growth was limited in the later stages. However, this was enough to give Brando a headache. However, his hand moved slightly and touched Scarlett's hand underneath him. He was stunned and lowered his head to see the red-haired girl lying flat on the ground, looking at him with her amber eyes. "I'm sorry. It's fine." Brando quickly let go of her hand and pulled out the dagger that was tied to his calf. Earth God's emissary retracted its hand and turned around. As a boss with high attack and defense, its agility was not high. Moreover, the bigger its body, the higher the agility penalty. Ekman was a little clumsy when it turned around, giving the two a chance. "Can you move?" Brando pulled out his dagger and asked. Scarlett sat up and patted the dust off her breastplate. She did not answer and only nodded. "Then be careful. That monster is very strong. Its elemental element is Earth Elemental, so be careful of its Earth Elemental attacks." Just as he finished speaking, Earth God's emissary roared as if to prove his words. It raised its right forelimb, and the limb was instantly petrified. The stony part of the limb quickly spread upwards, and in an instant, it became incomparably huge. The monster roared as if it was holding up a stone sword that was nearly 10 meters long. Then, it swung its sword towards the two of them. Dodge! Brando and Scarlett jumped to the left and right respectively. The stone sword hit their backs and exploded. At that moment, it was as if the ground of the entire forest had jumped, and a shockwave swept out in all directions from the point of explosion, quickly catching up to the two who were still running for their lives. The red-haired girl groaned, and Brendel spat out a mouthful of blood. He glanced at his own attributes and found that he had lost more than 30 HP just like that. It was close to the damage of the Ring of the Wind Empress. Moreover, he had the strength of a silver tier now. Even the Ring of the Wind Empress could only deal half of the damage to him. One could imagine the power of this attack. "Sir Lord, are you all right?" The forest was filled with smoke and dust, and Scarlett's voice came from the other side of the smoke. "It's all right." Brando coughed, but he was already on high alert. The Earth God's blood of God came from Goddess Gaia, and the ability to melt into stone was one of its innate abilities. Especially in this environment, if it hid underground and prepared to launch a sneak attack, he would suffer a great loss if he was not careful. However, he felt a little strange. He remembered that the cooldown from meld with the stone was 10 minutes. How did he lose track of the other party's aura so quickly? At this moment, let alone 10 minutes, he probably didn't even have a minute. But at this moment, the two people who were on high alert in the smoke suddenly heard a cry of surprise from outside the field. "Medisha!" Brando's heart tightened. Woo woo woo! When the long sound of the horn echoed through the battlefield, Hugel's mood could only be described as tangled. It was not as knowledgeable as Conrad, who could recognize the famous silver elves just from the unique sound. But it wasn't too bad, because from its position, it could easily see a row of silver-armored elven warriors, silver hair, and a shiny double-ended sword. Even if it was a fool, it knew who the other party was. Its subordinate's attack was quickly thwarted. No, it could not be described as thwarted. It was a one-sided defeat. The silver elves' charge was abnormally terrifying. They were like 10 shining silver blades. They cut into its subordinates like butter, entering and exiting its territory as if there was no one there. If not for Conrad's dark mercenaries rushing over in time, the battle would have turned into a complete defeat. However, the silver elves did not suffer any losses from the counterattack. The lizard men and dark mercenaries had just finished their counterattack. They threw out a strange crystal and retreated under the cover of the explosion. In the end, Hugel found that it had lost almost 10% of its forces on the left flank. The lizard man threw its dagger on the ground. It was a fugitive, and the failure of the gamble only made it mad. It could see that Conrad was afraid of the Silver Elves, but it was not afraid. Weren't they just a group of Silver Elves? The Silver Elves were just a so-so. The Cruz Empire's second-line standing army had this kind of strength, and it was not like Hugel had not fought with such an army before. It was originally a criminal that escaped from the Empire, or rather, it was an exiled criminal. It narrowed its eyes and observed for a while, but it soon found a problem. The Lizardman bandit leader immediately called for his assistant and ordered him to lead a group of men to attack from the back of the ruins. Although it was a taboo to divide the forces in battle, Hugel noticed that the enemy only had about 30 to 40 men coming back and forth. It decided to take a gamble and see if its guess was correct. But what Hugel did not know was that it had a strong ally at this time. It thought that Conrad, who it could rely on, was already prepared to escape. The lizardmen crossbowmen finally gathered. After a short while of adjusting their shooting range, they occupied a high point outside the ruins. The rain of arrows quickly flew into the air and fell down, covering both the lizardmen and the lizardmen. They did not know what aiming was, nor did they know what an extended attack was. The arrows and shafts hit the ground like rain. The silver elf Nalathar waved his hand behind him. He decisively gave the order to retreat. Seeing his signal, the mercenaries behind him immediately put away their crossbows and short bows and left in a single file. Only then did the elven warriors follow. After a short battle, there were casualties between the two sides. Many of the mercenaries were hit by arrows, and Sanford was even hit by a knife in the end. The knife pierced through the young man's thigh artery, and if Nalathar did not stop the bleeding in time, he would have already met Lady Martha. The mercenaries made a simple stretcher for him, and the young man lay weakly on it. He gritted his teeth to prevent himself from groaning. Death was a sacred and peaceful thing for mercenaries. They were not afraid of death, but they would not abandon their comrades either. But when Sanford turned his head, he saw a mercenary that he recognized running over from the ruins. "Isn't that guy from the Nightsong Tiger's side?" A thought flashed through his mind. "Mr. Nalathar." The mercenaries saw the situation and immediately shouted from afar. Captain Nightsong Tiger saw the lizard men moving towards the back of the ruins. He asked for your opinion. His words shocked everyone. Outflanking. This was the worst-case scenario that the young lord had predicted. They could not help but think of what Brando had said when he was planning the battle strategy. The young man told them that it was best to deal with all the situations according to the worst-case scenario, so that they would not be flustered. The Silver Elves did not say anything, but the mercenaries did not agree. Most of the mercenaries believed in the twin gods of fate, Alice and Helene. Of course, in this day and age where God had turned into the stars and the laws of the universe, this belief was more like a spiritual sustenance. But no matter what, a mercenary's mentality was similar to that of a gambler's. But now, the prophecy had come true. "Human, what did he say?" Nalathar asked. "The captain said that unless we split up, we would be attacked from the front and back." The mercenary replied loudly. "That's not a problem," the elven commander nodded, "but the question is, who will be the commander?" "Captain Nightsong Tiger thinks that Mr. Sanford can." The mercenary's gaze fell on the only stretcher, and he suddenly realized that he could not finish the rest of his sentence. Among Brando's subordinates that could participate in the battle, the Nightsong Tiger and Nalathar had the strongest leadership and the most experience. Then there was the fairy princess, Metasha, Scarlet, and himself. But these five could not leave at all, and the only one with a little bit of reputation left was Sanford, who had just joined the group. Brando had also assigned the tasks like this when he was planning the battle strategy. But the current situation left everyone dumbfounded. Sanford was seriously injured and had to leave the battle. This was worse than they had expected. The mercenaries looked at each other. "I'll go, Commander." A bell-like voice suddenly came from the ruins behind them. Everyone turned around and saw Romaine standing there with a sword in her hands, just like how she dragged the stone hammer in Brando's mansion in Bucci. She widened her eyes and looked at the others. Her light brown eyes seemed to be filled with a single sentence, "Can I?" "Of course not." Nalathar shook his head. If this had happened a day ago, the Silver Elf commander would have considered it. But what this young miss did last night was too shocking. He couldn't let her treat the battle as child's play. "Then let me go, Commander." A girl walked out from behind the Roman. She pressed one hand on her collar and pressed down on her shawl. She raised her head and calmly looked at everyone present. Nathaniel looked at Amandina. "I had studied Fongyu before." "Harmaine's Manual of Light Infantry, Monsieur Commandant." "Besides, at this time, I think it should be my responsibility," she replied. P.S. Looking for subscriptions and recommendations. Students who have the ability to help promote it are also okay. In addition, I recommend a rare good book about online games. It's very epic. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. I support the author and I support the original reading. Chapter 188. When Brando and Scarlet arrived, they saw Metisha pressing on her shoulder. There, blood had already soaked through the silver armor and dyed the snow-white battle robes red. She frowned as she stared at the monster in front of her, but Conrad was nowhere to be seen. The acolyte of Earth Ekman was also in a strange state. Its grayish-yellow carapace and stratum corneum had cracked open, revealing a dark red light that looked like flowing lava. If this thing looked like a huge yellow rock sculpture before, then now it looked a bit like granite that hadn't completely cooled and solidified. Brando was shocked when he saw Ekman in this state. This was the berserk state of the blood of gods. Even if the acolyte of gods was undead, it would still fall back a rank after going berserk. This meant that after this battle, it would degenerate into a larva. What was going on? Logically speaking, the acolyte of gods would not go berserk unless its life was in danger. This was similar to the berserk state of many bosses. It would only take effect when its HP was down to 30%. He then looked down at the monster's arm and saw a deep wound on Ekman's left waist. It was so deep that his bones could be seen. Brendel guessed that he must have been hit by one of Medusa's 1,000-army strike when he saw the wound. But this was not the only explanation for his question. With Ekman's tenacity, he would not have been hit by the 1,000-army strike. Even a direct hit would not have dealt less than 110 HP, so it would not have gone berserk. There was only one possibility left. It had received an order and went berserk. Brando turned his head and saw Metisha looking at him apologetically with her silver eyes. "I'm sorry, my lord." The fairy princess gritted her teeth and whispered, "I let Conrad escape." Brendel blushed with shame. In fact, it was his negligence. He did not expect Ekman to attack in the east and attack in the west. In his opinion, Ekman was an insect that had been contaminated by the blood of gods. It should not have such intelligence. But he did not expect that as long as Conrad controlled the scabbard, he would be able to make decisions for it. "This isn't your fault." The three of them stood together, facing off against the Earth God emissary. At the same time, Brando asked, "What just happened?" "That man wanted to use a trap to lure me in, but I saw through it. After that, he summoned this monster and tried to escape under the cover of the monster." Metisha covered her mouth and coughed. Her hands were stained with blood. "Cough cough, I tried to stop them with the 1,000-army strike. Unexpectedly, the monster suddenly mutated and broke free from my gravitational restraint. That's how the wound came about." Metisha nodded. "Is it important?" Brando frowned. The Angel of Earth's strength had increased by 20% after it went berserk. If Metasha had taken a direct hit from it, her injuries would not have been light. "It's alright, it's just a graze. Cough cough." The Silver Fairy Princess replied, "But it seems like the elemental power has seeped into my lungs and injured it." "That's fine." Brando was sweating profusely, but then he remembered that Metasha was in a spiritual state, and the wounds were just external manifestations of her soul fire being shaken. It was true that she was not like a human, whose battle strength would be greatly reduced. "What do we do now?" Scarlet asked. "We have to change the plan." Brando stared at the motionless Earth God emissary. He could not understand why Conrad was in such a hurry to separate from the three of them. He did not even hesitate to use the precious blood of gods to make the god emissary enter a berserk state. "Scarlet, you and Metasha will chase after that man. Don't let him mess up our plans. As for here, leave it to me." "You?" The red-haired girl turned her head, a trace of doubt flashing in her eyes. "My lord." Metasha was also stunned. As a summoned creature, she naturally knew Brando's strength. No matter how experienced a silver-ranked warrior was, it was impossible for him to be a match for a monster that had activated its elemental power. It was impossible for him to even stall for time. "Have you forgotten my true abilities, Miss Metasha?" Brando replied in his mind. "Are you talking about a planeswalker, my lord?" The Silver Fairy Princess replied in her mind. Brando nodded. "I'll go with you." Scarlet suddenly replied. She gripped her halberd tightly as she stared at the giant monster in front of her. Even though the monster was motionless, as if it was dead, there was not a trace of its aura. But the three of them knew that if they moved, the monster would immediately attack. "If you die, Metasha and I will not have the confidence to deal with this monster. In order to protect the remaining members of the Grey Wolves mercenaries, your life is my life." Brando was stunned. "Miss Scarlet is right, my lord," Metasha also replied, her voice soft. "As long as this monster is not here, even if I am alone, Conrad will not be able to defeat me. Conrad is no match for me. Wizard hunters, I've fought many of them in the Myrna." "All right." Conrad knew that this was not the time to argue, and with Scarlet's help, his chances of success would be higher. He took out his second card of the day, "Then let's split up." As he spoke, he revealed the card that he was holding. Silver Foal, Legendary Splendor V, White, Mana 10, Treasure, Strange Item, Divine Item, Level 7 Construct. The Silver Foal has the ability to float. Made from Mithril. The moment the card of fate appeared in the air, it immediately formed a magic circle on the ground. A white light flashed from the magic circle, and the neighing of a warhorse could be heard from within. Conrad wasn't an idiot. He was afraid that the brainless insect messenger would be lured away by the diversion tactic. Therefore, he ordered it to stay put and wait for orders. If it sensed that someone was going to chase after it, Ekman would be authorized to attack. And magic was one of the conditions. But as soon as it moved, Scarlet and Metasha went up to meet it. The halberd and spear collided, and the monster's attack was blocked. Even though the two girls were only at the lower gold rank, Scarlet was a god's messenger, and her power resonated with the lightning element. Metasha, on the other hand, was a spirit that had already comprehended the soul element. The two elements intertwined and blocked Ekman's attack. Even so, the two of them groaned and retreated 3 to 4 steps before stabilizing themselves. At this moment, the white light in front of Brando disappeared, and a mithril warhorse with a pair of wings stepped out of the magic circle with its head held high. It glanced at Brendel with its ruby eyes, then immediately lowered its head respectfully. The red-haired girl was stunned when she saw it, but she immediately understood what Brando meant. "Scarlet, get on the horse." Conrad ordered. "Metasha, cover us." The messenger of the earth wanted to attack first. But the Silver Fairy Princess had already received the order to use her spirit spear to push it back. Medicia's skills had a long cooldown, but her attack power was terrifying. Even Ekman was unwilling to take the attack head-on. But when it dodged, Scarlet took the chance to get on the horse. She then reached out to Brando and pulled him up as well. The two of them riding on the same horse made her feel a little awkward, but she sighed and quickly calmed down. Let's go around its back. This brainless thing is following orders to the death. We have to get its attention first. Brando whispered behind her back. He then ordered Medicia, stay where you are. Medicia, wait for us to leave before you move. I understand. Medicia nodded. At this moment, Scarlet had already urged her horse forward. The mithril warhorse leapt into the air and flew over its head. Not only that, she even took out the crossbow on her boots and shot an arrow down. Her actions immediately attracted Ekman's counterattack. The giant insect-like boss roared and pressed its hand down. A 20-meter-long stone pillar shot out from the ground and chased after Scarlet and Brando. Scarlet snorted and continued to ride her mithril warhorse. The stone spikes seemed to be right behind them as they rose from the ground one after another with a roar. Each one was higher than the previous one, and the last one pierced almost 40 to 50 meters into the sky. The forest fell silent. Looking up from below, the dense stone spikes almost formed a crisscrossing forest of giant stalagmites. The moment the messenger of the earth's hand left the ground, the stone pillars immediately crumbled. It looked at the mithril warhorse that was flying further and further away and let out a low growl. Then, it landed on its hands and melted into the ground. This was the last thing Medicia saw. In fact, she had seen with her own eyes how this thing came out of the ground to attack Brando. She knew that it was using the same trick to chase after them. She was relieved. She looked around and recalled the direction Conrad escaped in. Then, she patted her unicorn companion's neck and ordered it to chase in that direction at full speed. Brando, who was in the air, saw this scene as well. He immediately ordered Scarlet to lower their altitude. Even though the insect-like creature did not have much intelligence, it still retained its natural instincts. It would not chase after a prey that it could never catch. That was why in the past games, luring monsters was a skill that required a lot of skill. It was the same in this world. He had to give it hope. The mithril warhorse quickly lowered its altitude and slowed down under Scarlet's control. But this did not mean that they had let down their guard. On the contrary, Brando was paying close attention to their surroundings. What do we do next? Scarlet asked. Bring this thing back, Brando replied in a low voice. It would be best if we return to the place where we fought yesterday. According to the plan, Nalathar and the others will support us after they deal with the lizard men. Can we last until then? She asked. That depends on skill and a bit of luck. Scarlet was silent. Then, she suddenly swung her halberd in a certain direction. An arc of lightning immediately crossed a distance of several dozen meters and hit the ground between a few black pine trees. With a loud bang, a boss that was as tall as 3 people broke out of the ground. Leave the ground and go around in a zigzag pattern, Brando immediately ordered. Give me your crossbow. Scarlet immediately nodded. The mithril warhorse changed its direction, and a sharp rock flew past the two of them. Brando secretly wiped away his cold sweat. He thought that it was fortunate that Scarlet's reaction was fast enough. Otherwise, the two of them would have been sent flying. But he also knew that this was only the beginning of the dangerous game. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 189. Reports were quickly sent back through various channels. At the back of the Great Basilica, there was a ceremonial hall and a series of prayer rooms. This hall was once occupied by Hugel, and it was connected to the altar at the back. Below it were rows of monks' residences, and there were 2 outer walls at the back of the ruins. The ceremonial hall was not only the tallest building in the ruins, but it was also the core of the entire ruins. It was also the first place that Amandina set her eyes on. The mercenaries were like ants shuttling through the ruins. They received Amandina's orders and passed through the courtyard of the great basilica. The courtyard used to be the place where the silver elves prayed and meditated, but the beautiful and tranquil sanctuary was now in ruins. The beautiful and exquisite white corridors were now left with only a few pillars. The silent forest of pillars seemed to be filled with whispers of the past, narrating the history of this place. In this silence, the first 3 mercenaries of Lopez arrived at their destination. They set up a defensive line at the core of the great basilica, the second outer wall at the northwest corner of the ceremonial hall. From there, they could observe the lizard men in the forest. The silver elves had built 2 outer walls as a defensive line for this sacred and forbidden area. But after several centuries, the weathered walls had almost collapsed. Today, apart from the height difference between the first and second outer walls, the back of the ceremonial hall was almost undefended. And the lizard men did not seem to have any intention of repairing these fortifications. There were 2 main reasons for this. First, they did not have the ability to do so. The elves' defensive line was designed by skilled craftsmen, and the entire defensive line was intricate and complex. Hugel could not understand how they were going to rebuild the walls that had been reduced to rubble. Second, they did not need to do so. In this forest, the lizardmen's only natural enemy was their drunkenness and brawl. Almost every year, there would be more than 10 casualties. Of course, now they had another natural enemy, and that was Brando. The second group of mercenaries arrived at the other side of the gap. The lizard men have passed through the forest. They are approaching the ruins. There are at least 100 of them. Discovered the command center. The mercenaries used sign language to communicate, and Amandina happened to see it. The girl lifted her skirt and quickly walked through the ceremony hall, arriving at the platform outside the hall where important ceremonies were held. This was the highest point in the ruins. Standing at the edge of the platform, she could overlook the entire back half of the great holy temple. The intricate defense system of the silver elves suddenly became clear in her eyes. The girl lowered her head and compared it with the sketch in her hand. Due to the limited time, she had drawn it in a hurry, but at this moment, it looked pretty close. Her professional knowledge of architecture came into play at this moment. This was the Silver Elves' fortress system from 5 centuries ago, and it happened to be the one she was most familiar with. She turned back, and, with all her strength, lifted from the ground the banner, which consisted, in fact, of 2 spears bound together and a piece of grey cloth, no design, no emblem, not even any distinguishing mark. The cloth was made from Brando's cloak. She raised the flag and pointed in a certain direction. This meant 2 things. The first was to inform Nalathar and the Nightsong Tiger that the rear was still standing. As long as this flag was still there, they didn't need to divide their forces. The second was, Grey Wolves mercenaries, defend the 4th breach. But when the Grey Wolves mercenaries saw this order, they couldn't help but look at each other. The platform used to be an extremely safe place, but that was only in the past because half of it had already collapsed. If the lizard men broke through the front, they could easily rush to Amandina's position. Brando had told them that their duty was to protect the noble's daughter, but now she wanted them to go to the other side. Miss Amandina, one of the mercenaries asked loudly. Listen to my orders. But Amandina waved her hand and said loudly, I am the commander now. Obey my orders. As for what happens next, that is a matter for the future. The mercenaries stopped talking. But the girl on the platform frowned. She raised her head and saw that the lizard men were coming out of the forest one after another. Their formation was very scattered, which meant that the other party might have noticed the weakness of their inferior numbers. But this wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she only had 15 men, and she didn't have the advantage in terms of individual strength. A medium iron ranked against a medium iron ranked was at most a 1-4 or 1-5 exchange. She could only delay for as long as possible. Amandina clenched her teeth and gripped the flagpole tightly. Brando's forehead was covered in sweat. He couldn't remember how many times he and Qianxi had changed directions because they were too close to each other. He could almost see the tension in Qianxi's heart. Her heart was pounding in her delicate body, and her breathing was becoming more rapid. This was a sign that her stamina was beginning to decline. "You said. Charge. How long do we have before we can use it?" Scarlet asked while panting. "Give me 20 more seconds." Brando had been calculating the time in his mind. "No, we can't delay them for that long." She immediately shook her head. Brendel turned his head to look. He hoped that this answer was not true, but he knew that it was an impossible assumption. Ekman had caught up to them, just as he had expected. Even though it was clumsy, the monster's speed in a straight line was astonishing. It only needed a few steps to make up for the distance it left behind. But Brando knew that he couldn't let Scarlet keep changing directions. At this rate, they wouldn't be able to lure the monster to their designated location even if the sky turned dark. Floating in the air could solve this problem for a while, but they gradually realized that the monster was becoming smarter. It used the stone pillars to attack the horses in the sky, but without the obstruction of the trees, it was like hitting a target. "We can't float," Brando replied. Scarlet gritted her teeth. The young man looked back again and saw that Ekman was getting closer and closer to him. He didn't dare to hesitate and threw a disintegration crystal behind him. The monster covered its head with its hands as a series of explosions sounded out. It didn't seem to have stopped at all as it leaped out from the smoke. The red-haired girl also felt the threat coming from behind. She had no choice but to order her horse to leap into the air. But Ekman thrust his hands forward, and the stone pillars immediately shot out from the ground behind them, heading straight for them. Scarlet immediately ordered her horse to change directions. However, it was inevitable for her to feel tired after such a long period of time. Her reaction was slow, and the stone pillar accurately hit the warhorse's rear thigh. The back of the platinum warhorse's body tilted, and it was sent flying and crashed into a tree. Brando and the red-haired girl were caught off guard by the huge impact. When the young man realized what had happened, he was already on the ground. At that moment Brendel almost thought that he had returned to that night in Butchie's old mansion. When he was thrown out by the skeleton, he had the same feeling of confusion. It was as if a bomb had been thrown into his head. But the first thing he was worried about was not whether he had a concussion from the fall, or if there were any other problems. That was because he knew that there was another one that could kill him at any time. He was in big trouble. He was holding the last disintegration crystal in his hand. At the same time, he shook his head and subconsciously wanted to stand up, but before he could react, a hand pressed down on his chest and pressed him down. "Listen carefully." It was Scarlet's voice. Brando tried to open his eyes, but his vision was blurry. He could only see her face faintly. The red-haired girl was looking at him. "I'll delay that guy and buy you some time." "What are you going to do?" Brando shook his head and asked dizzily. He felt a sharp pain in his back, and he wondered if his spine was going to break. "Don't worry about me. I'm also an oracle. That brainless thing can at most injure me. I think I was the one who told you about the characteristics of an oracle." Cough, cough. Brando's eyes were half closed, and his vision was still not clear. He coughed and struggled to sit up. Then, he felt someone supporting him. "Humph," the girl snorted and let go of him. "The horse is behind. Don't waste time." After saying that, she lifted her halberd and turned around. In her field of vision, the huge monster had already knocked down 3 trees and was rushing towards them. Scarlet leveled her halberd and gritted her teeth. Brendel looked at Scarlet's back and could not help but be surprised. However, he immediately struggled to get up and grab the reins of the platinum colt. He didn't dare to waste time, and now was not the time to argue. Scarlet had made her choice, and he could only cooperate. This was the most basic rule in a team. Otherwise, the opportunity would be wasted if he hesitated. Brando mounted the horse and gave the order to gallop. He turned around and saw that Scarlet had already been sent flying by the Oracle of Earth. The girl was like a stone as she flew into the forest, and a series of crackling sounds could be heard. Then, there was no sound. A lower gold rank was powerless in front of an awakened elemental power. After the Oracle of Earth confirmed that the enemy had lost the ability to fight, it once again set its sights on the bug that was still running away. No one gave it an order, and the Oracle of Earth was controlled by the violent nature of the blood of God. Its first target was naturally to kill everything that could move. Especially when Brando was afraid that it would continue to cause trouble for the red-haired tigress, so he threw a disintegration crystal at it. Without a doubt, the monster's aggro returned to the young man. But the time that Scarlet had bought was useful. Because at this moment, Brando finally activated his charge skill that was in cooldown again. After 3 turns, he left a silver line in the forest. In fact, with the boost from the Platinum Warhorse, Brando's speed had exceeded 1000 OZ for the first time since he came to this world. This number was infinitely close to the peak of his agility in his previous life. If someone was lucky enough to see this scene from above, they would definitely see a beautiful silver line cutting through the forest. It would directly split the forest into 2 and extend into the distance. P.S. Continuous bursts are too tiring, so I need to take a break. Today I went to the Korean server to play Terra. Sigh, the Koreans are indeed ahead of the Chinese. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 190. The beast men had a proverb called Orsitrismasak, which meant that even a beast at the end of its road would still have the strength to fight back. Brando felt that this proverb was the most appropriate one to describe his current situation, but it was only limited to the first half of the proverb. The difference was that he couldn't bite anyone even if he wanted to. The Platinum Warhorse still had some strength left, but Brando himself couldn't support it anymore. As the saying goes, the evils you bring upon yourself are the hardest to bear. When Brando used charge on the Platinum Warhorse, he didn't consider the relationship between vitality, dexterity and strength endurance in the game. To be honest, he couldn't be blamed, because in the game, it was difficult for a low-level player to obtain a pet that was much stronger than them. Thus, when the Platinum Warhorse burst out with 1,320 ounces, the maximum speed of both man and horse exceeded 25 times the speed of sound in an instant. After passing through the cone-shaped shockwave, the air resistance that Brando had to endure was like a fly flying into a piece of tempered glass at a speed of 10 km per second. Even though Brendel's perception was 5 times stronger than a normal person's and he was able to react to his mistake in a fraction of a second, it was still a little too late. The Platinum Colt crossed a distance of nearly 16 miles in a single leap, to the point that its terrifying speed formed an unnatural and magnificent bright silver belt in the forest. However, Brando also saw that his HP had reached its limit. Blood seeped out from his mouth, nose, eyes and ears, and his organs were all damaged. After his HP reached the critical point, he immediately entered a weakened state. Brando coughed out a mouthful of blood, and the only thing he was thankful for was that he didn't die immediately. It was also thanks to his vitality that was 20 times stronger than a normal person, and his powerful regeneration and defense that his organs weren't completely damaged. If this injury was inflicted on him when he first transmigrated, he would probably be dead by now. However, with his high vitality, he believed that he would be fine as long as he recuperated for a period of time after the battle. However, there were two problems right now. The first was that he didn't have time to recuperate. The second was that the Angel of Earth wouldn't give him the time to recuperate. The battle was still ongoing. Although the Acolyte of Earth was huge in size, its movements were clumsy, and its speed was one of the slowest among level 60 creatures, but one step of a dragon is equivalent to 10 steps of a human. Even so, it still had a basic agility of close to 200 ounces. It would only need 8 or 9 seconds to catch up with the distance of more than 10 miles. In his desperation, Brando could only think of a solution that wasn't really a solution. He let his Platinum Warhorse lure the other party away, even if he had to be prepared to abandon his cart and enter the graveyard. He raised his head and looked at the position of the sun. He was already very close to the predetermined location. Even though it seemed like he had traveled for half a day, that was because he had plenty of time, and also because he had to take care of Amandina and the Roman. It was impossible for him to travel as fast as he could with Ekman. Don't underestimate the fact that they had only been running for a few minutes, and that they had repeatedly changed directions. But even so, they had already gone about 50 or 60 li south into the hilly region. Brando was drenched in cold sweat when he recalled the entire process. Traveling 50 or 60 li was equivalent to recovering half of the Silver Elf strength, which was equivalent to reaching the level of a gold-ranked warrior. 20 gold-ranked warriors were more than enough to deal with a level 60 boss. What he needed to do now was to stall for time as much as possible. Once Nalathar ended the battle, he would rush over at full speed. With their speed, they would need at least 10 minutes to reach this place. In other words, he had to hold on for at least 30 minutes. Brando spent a few seconds to roughly check his plan. When he did not find any obvious loopholes, he dismounted and patted the Acolyte of Earth's long metal cheeks. This mechanical creature seemed to be created by the gods. It was incredibly precise and sturdy, as if it would never tire. Even after receiving multiple attacks from the Acolyte of Earth, it remained unharmed. It was the best person to carry out his plan. But if he lost his warhorse, he would lose the ability to continue running. Doing so would be akin to drinking poison to quench his thirst. This was not the same as making decisions in the game. Brando was gambling with his life. His heart could not help but beat rapidly. Even so, he still decisively gave the order. BMW Silver. Go! He shouted the name he gave his warhorse and pointed at the path they came from. As for the details of the order, he could fill in the details in his mind. The Platinum Warhorse was not a natural creature, so it naturally did not fear Brando. It raised its head and looked at him with its ruby eyes to confirm the order. Then, he turned around and disappeared into the forest. Brendel pressed on his chest and endured the pain as he exhaled softly. He took out the Platinum Warhorse card and listened carefully in the direction of the forest. Not long after, Acolyte of Earth's roar came from the same direction, startling a flock of birds. As long as one did not fall into a state of madness, there would always be a time when one's hands and feet would turn cold. Hugel was like a red-eyed gambler as he sent his men into the battle in the great temple of Balagon. But it was like a bottomless pit. Initially, it was as if he had a stroke of luck and sent a portion of his men to attack the rear of the enemy. The situation took a turn for the better. The enemy had lost their long-range cover, and Hugel's lizardmen crossbowmen were slowly gathering together. Under this situation, the Silver Elves quickly gave up on the front lines and the battle gradually spread to every street and alley in the Great Temple. But the good news ended there. The Silver Elves launched a counterattack and then retreated. They had lost a comrade, but what shocked Hugel the most was that the Silver Elf's corpse turned into a white light and flew towards a certain direction in the south. It was a direction it was all too familiar with. It was the graveyard of the Silver Elf King. This was the first time the Lizardman commander suspected the origin of the Silver Elves. But after a while, he found that he did not have the chance. The large group of lizard men that had been sent to the rear of the battlefield had not been heard from until now. Instead, a flag was raised in the direction of the ceremony hall. In the end, the morale of the lizard men plummeted, and their originally smooth offensive came to a halt. The Silver Elves took the opportunity to counterattack and took back another wall. Cugel was so angry that he vomited blood, but there was nothing he could do. At the very least, he had begun to attack, and the advantage of having more people was beginning to show. But just as he was about to take advantage of the situation, he turned around and was surprised to find that he no longer had any reserves. That feeling was like a crazy gambler turning around to grab his chips, only to find that he had nothing left. However, all the chips that originally belonged to him were now on the gambling table, but the balance of the war was slowly tilting to one side. The 20 Silver Elves were still as steady as a great wall of steel, standing firm in the dark green tide. Cugel felt his hands and feet turn cold. But compared to the other Silver Elves whose brains had not fully evolved, Cugel was still considered one of the smarter ones. He pondered for a moment and immediately understood the cause and effect of the whole situation. Thus, he immediately called for his deputy and ordered, "Have the lieutenants on the front lines press forward and push the front lines forward a bit." "Boss, are we going to launch an all-out attack?" The green-skinned deputy with a protruding mouth and monkey-like cheeks asked. "No." Cugel shook his head. "We are preparing to retreat, only us. But our brothers, don't worry about them, we don't have time to care about them now." Cugel shook his head helplessly. He held the shining necklace with 3 thin fingers and replied, "As long as we have this, we can re-enter this region with the help of the tree herders. I think I have figured out where the Silver Elves came from, and I will be more prepared next time." "But are we leaving just like that? Aren't we going to inform Conrad?" the deputy asked. Cugel was a little hesitant, but he immediately shook his head. "Don't worry, that bastard is an envoy. Even without us, he can still protect himself. But if Conrad died in the region it was in charge of, it would not be able to bear the consequences, so it was a little hesitant." In the tree herders, members of the tree herders who cooperated with and commanded the divine envoys were called envoys, and those who carried the divine blood were called breeders or experimenters. Cugel could not help but look at the battle situation. On the surface, the lizard men were still on the offensive, and their casualties were still less than 20%. However, the Silver Elves did not show any signs of collapsing. On the contrary, they continued to inflict casualties on the lizard men. Bandits had no discipline to speak of, and Cugel believed that once the casualties reached 30% or the battle lasted for more than 20 minutes, these bastards would quickly collapse. At that time, even if it wanted to escape, it would have to depend on the mood of the enemy. Cugel's experienced eyes had been honed through the long struggle between Kurlutz and the Empire. In its homeland, the lizard men were slaves to the crews, and their struggles lasted for centuries. Cugel was one of them, but he acted more like a bandit. But it was precisely because he was a bandit that he was confident in his intuition for danger. In reality, the battle had only lasted for 32 minutes. When Nalathar sensed a strange emotion coming from the back of the lizard men army and began to waver, this Silver Elf commander with hundreds of years of experience decisively seized the opportunity. He blew the dragon horn again, and the elven warriors mustered the last of their strength to charge again. The lizardmen's crossbow bolts bounced off the elven warriors' armor, and the 20 elven warriors charged shoulder to shoulder like a moving wall. The lizard men collapsed. The dark green tide began to recede, and the command was disintegrated one by one. But when they finally realized that Cugel was no longer there, this retreat turned into a true rout. Nalathar ordered his men to pursue the lizard men for a few hundred meters, but the lizard men screamed and stomped on each other as they fled back into the forest. Looking from the direction of the ruins, it was as if the ground was covered with scattered green cockroaches. Apart from the corpses, everything else had quickly escaped, leaving everyone dumbfounded. If Brando was here, he would definitely tease these elven warriors. The enemy's advance is too fast for our army to catch up. To be honest, I really despise April Fool's Day. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.cheedian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 191. The elven commander took off his golden helmet and shook his head, letting his beautiful silver hair flow down like a waterfall. He then let out a long sigh. His pale silver eyes stared coldly at the mess on the battlefield. The lizardmen's corpses were scattered among the ruins, and their blood flowed like a small stream. The air was filled with a pungent smell. This smell was enough to make most normal people nauseous, but to the elven warriors who were bathed in blood, it was the smell of victory that floated in the air. No, it was far from victory. Kujal ran away, and his men wanted to chase after him, but Nalathar stopped them. The elven commander sheathed his gold-plated sword into its scabbard and ordered his men to gather and prepare for the next step of the operation. His orders were decisive and precise, without the slightest hesitation. At the same time, he saw the Nightsong Tiger leading another group of elves over from the other side of the battlefield. It was not the first time the Nightsong Tiger had seen Nalathar, but he could not help but be taken aback. Nalathar exuded an aura of beauty after the bloody battle. He was already a little too feminine to begin with, but the bloodstains on his golden armor made for a jarring contrast. Coupled with the silver elf's traditional long silver hair and cold expression on his face, he gave off a demonic allure. "Commander," the Nightsong Tiger was taken aback, but he quickly reacted, "The battle here is over." "Yes." Nalathar nodded. He turned around. The gray flag in the direction of the ceremonial hall was still fluttering high, but no one knew the extent of the battle there. "But it is far from victory." Nalathar replied, "We will follow the original plan and return the way we came. I hope that your lord will fulfill his promise and not play with his life." "Wait," the Nightsong Tiger interrupted, "my lord's original order was not like this." Nalathar looked down at him. "You saw that monster yourself. Even if we were at our peak, we would still need to fight 3 against 1 to not be at a disadvantage. Do you really believe that your lord can hold it off for more than half an hour?" The Silver Elf commander asked coldly, "Mr. Captain, the way I judge a battle is to win. On the battlefield against the Dark Dragon, there is no room for mercy. But, I don't have time to discuss this with you. I'm just reporting our actions to our allies as usual. In other words, Lady Amandina or your lord. In my opinion, the latter is far more important than the former. Which side do you choose?" The elven commander replied. The Nightsong Tiger fell silent and looked at Amandina's direction. Nalathar shook his head. "All right, human. Let me explain. Medisha sacrificed her life for this reason. It may seem strange to you, but in our history, forgiving ourselves is giving up hope for tomorrow. I hope you can understand this." He lowered his head and whispered, "I've already asked for Miss Amandina's permission in private." With that, he stood up and waved his hand. "Phoenix Guards, prepare to depart." Just as Nalathar and the Nightsong Tiger expected, the first battle under Amandina's command did not go well. Since there was no place to defend, the lizard men quickly broke through the first wall. There were no obvious obstacles, and the mercenaries were exposed to the enemy's crossbowmen. Even if they retaliated from afar, it was difficult to form a large group. But at this moment, the mercenaries of Lopez's tenacious fighting spirit was undeniable. Under the attacks of the 3 mercenaries at the outermost perimeter and the enemies that outnumbered them by 30, they lost their positions 3 times in a row. The lizardmen's attacks were so dense that Amandina's 2 orders for reinforcements were blocked halfway. The last remaining mercenary detonated the only exploding crystal he had, causing the largest number of lizard men casualties since the start of the battle. About 15 lizard men collapsed on the stairs between the first and second outer walls. But after that, the battle became bloody. The mercenaries of Lopez and the lizard men engaged in a cruel tug-of-war. Almost every stronghold that could be defended was fought over by both sides. After a 22 for exchange, the lizard men finally broke through the outer wall and began to attack the central platform outside the altar hall. It had been 19 minutes since the start of the battle, and 10 minutes since the first contact from the rear. The mercenaries began to shrink back, but this was not a long-term plan. The space left for them to shrink back gradually became narrower. Amandina was behind them. An arrow brushed past her fair face as it flew past. Blood quickly seeped out from her cut skin, but she did not feel it at all. She held the flagpole with both hands and stood firmly at the edge of the platform. She was calculating the time and the changes in the battle. She was waiting for an opportunity. But every mercenary's death on the battlefield made her heart sink. Brendel had never had any casualties when he was leading them, but it had only been 10 minutes since he handed them over to her, and the number of casualties had already reached this point. This was especially so when the little elven girl named Tia rushed over to block the fatal arrow for her. This noble daughter who had never personally experienced any war almost felt the tears in her eyes bursting out uncontrollably. But she bit her lips tightly and endured it. She used one hand to place the pale elven girl on the ground. Her body was still warm, as if she had just fallen asleep. Amandina felt someone pass her a handkerchief. She turned her head in surprise and saw Falern looking at her calmly. She was the elder sister of the dead girl. "You're injured, Miss Amandina." "No, it's fine." Amandina took a deep breath and choked out, "I'm sorry." Falern's pink lips moved. She wanted to say something, but she held back. Brando did not say anything, and she could not speak so easily either. "Please give the flagpole to me, Miss Amandina. It's not safe here." She hesitated for a moment and said. Amandina shook her head. "No, this is my position." This was her promise to Brando. She told herself that she had to keep it. The lizard men had already broken through the fourth line of defense, and the mercenaries retreated once more. Both sides were close to the slope formed by the collapse of the platform. From the distance, it was less than 50 meters. Falern saw that the lizardmen's crossbowmen had already raised their crossbows and aimed at the sky. Their accuracy was not high, but after repeated attempts, they were able to pinpoint the position under the flag. She frowned and stood in front of Amandina, one hand holding onto the thin elven sword at her waist. Like her sister, she did not have any spells left, but even so, she still had to complete her mission. "Falern." "Yes." "Thank you." Amandina coughed and said softly. She smiled faintly, but her eyes fell back to the ground. Her expression quickly became serious again. The lizard men tightened their crossbows, and a series of creaking noises could be heard from their group. But when they raised their crossbows again, she was not sure if she could block all the bolts. She gritted her teeth and unconsciously gripped the hilt of her sword. She raised her crossbow. Amandina and Falern both felt their breath catch in their throat. Even if they were prepared to face death, they would still feel a sense of despair when they were about to face it head-on. But it seemed that the scene they imagined did not happen, because a small shining crystal suddenly flew out from behind them. It drew a beautiful arc in the air and fell into the group of lizard men below. It was like a blood-red flower blooming in a dark green ocean. With a loud bang, the lizardmen's severed limbs and internal organs flew in all directions. Then, it rained down like a rain of blood. Everyone was stunned, including the lizard men, the mercenaries, and even Amandina and Falern. The only disintegration crystal they had left was the one in Amandina's hand, but she clearly gave it to the three mercenaries to use. Amandina subconsciously turned her head. She immediately heard a clang, and a long sword was thrown up from the ruins behind her. She immediately saw the Roman crawling up on all fours. She lay down on the platform as if she was about to die. She gasped for air as she looked at Amandina with a smug smile. Phew, I almost got lost. Phew, phew, phew. It wasn't easy to find this place. Phew, Amandina, I've learned swordsmanship, I can protect you. Phew. I'm so tired. Wait, Amandina was stunned for a moment before asking, Roman, why are you here? No. That's not it, I mean, didn't you give the disintegration crystal to Brando? Amandina looked wronged when she heard this. She pressed down on her bag and whispered, that. Amandina, I only hit a little bit. How much? Wait. Amandina suddenly understood. No wonder she felt that the explosion that night was not right. She immediately grabbed the Roman's shoulder. Damn it, didn't you say that you used those last night? Is it those? Definitely not that many. Roman guarantees that Roman only has 9. No, 8. Roman's expression changed, and he immediately shook his head like a rattledrum, while rolling his eyes and replying. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 192. In fact, not long after Hugel escaped from the battlefield, he received news from his subordinates that Conrad had escaped long ago. Hugel was so angry that he couldn't help but curse, but he was also secretly happy. Originally, if he were to retreat first and leave Conrad alone, he would inevitably be reprimanded in the end. It was not impossible for him to be punished. If it wasn't for the secret of the Elf King's tomb in its hands, it wouldn't have dared to leave its subordinates behind and run away. Otherwise, it would have to bear the consequences of its actions. But now that Conrad had left first, the situation was completely different. Conrad had become the scapegoat, and Hugel had become the leader of the resistance. If it wasn't for the fact that he was the one who lured the Silver Elves out, Hugel would have been able to use this to make Conrad suffer. But even so, it was enough to make Hugel happy. Besides, didn't he still have other chips in his hands? Those damn elves. When it thought of this, it couldn't help but feel unhappy again. At the same time, it cursed in a low voice. No matter what, all the wealth that he had plundered over the years was stored in the hall of the Balagon Temple. Now that he had to give it away, he couldn't help but gnash his teeth in anger. But just as he was cursing in his heart, he bumped into his deputy who was leading the way. Hugel had nowhere to vent his anger, and this time, he found a way to explode. You brainless idiot. What are you doing? The leader of the lizard men suddenly realized that something was wrong. It raised its head abruptly, and a tall figure was reflected in its prismatic pupils. No, to be precise, it was a tall knight riding on a snow-white unicorn. His entire body was covered in heavy silver chainmail, and he wore a pointed golden helmet with a pair of wings protecting his face. At the top of the helmet was a white mane that hung down to the back of his shoulders. Behind him, there were rows of similar knights standing neatly behind him. The tall elven cavalry looked as if they were cast from the same mold, and every one of them was about the same height. They stood quietly in the middle of the forest, and there was not a single sound in the woods. The knight looked down at Hugel from above. His silver eyes were calm, but it sent chills down Hugel's spine. Then he spoke with a gentle and low voice. If I'm not wrong, you should be called Hugel. Lizard, Mr. Hugel, right? Hugel opened his mouth. He subconsciously wanted to deny it, but he found that he couldn't say a word under the pressure of the knight's aura. Very good, the knight nodded. In fact, my comrades and I have been looking for you for a long time. Hugel's eyes darkened. In this world, there was only one army that would call their comrades comrades. They were the Silver Elves, the Hymns Knights. 10 minutes. Brando threw out the dimmed card in his hand. The card of fate with the image of the platinum stallion burned in the dirt, and then nothing was left. Now there was another card in the graveyard, and it made him a little unhappy. Not only did the graveyard not decrease, but there were more and more. Furthermore, his card pool was already thin, and it made things worse. He looked into the forest. It was silent. Ekman's sense of smell was terrible, but his hearing and sight were very good. Its 6 limbs had hearing organs that could pick up over 700,000 different sounds in the natural world. It could distinguish sounds at least 3 times the frequency of a human's. But it was 4 to 5 miles away, and if he didn't make a sound, it would be difficult for the enemy to find him. Brando thought for a moment. He wanted to wait a little longer, but he was afraid that the enemy would turn back and cause trouble for Scarlet. If that happened, the red-haired tigress wouldn't even be able to defeat a normal person. So he raised his right hand and used the ring of the Wind Empress to fire at the direction of the forest. Since the ring had almost no effect on an elemental awakened monster, it was good enough to make a loud noise to lure the enemy. As expected, when Brando put down his hand, he heard the sound of trees falling in the forest. The acolyte of Earth reacted quickly and rushed towards him. But Brando wasn't nervous. He took a deep breath and took out a ruby from his clothes. He held the ruby in his hand and counted the time in his heart. 10, 9, 8. The sound of the trees falling was very fast, and it was as if it was just an illusion in his ears, but it soon became real. 5, 4, 3, it's here. Brendel used his middle finger to squeeze the gem between his index finger and thumb, placing it in the middle of what the witches called the magic triangle. Then he silently chanted the activation spell in his mind. The ruby flashed with a red light, and the surrounding 10 meters became silent. The sound of the wind, the rustling of the leaves, even the heartbeat, breathing, and the pulsation of the blood vessels, all sounds disappeared. Brando saw a light green number appear in his vision, 610. The acolyte of Earth stopped in its tracks. The insect-like monster couldn't help but look around in confusion, but it soon realized that it had lost track of the faint heartbeat. But just as its simple brain was hesitating whether or not to turn back, a beautiful white deer suddenly appeared in the monster's field of vision. This thing actually dared to stroll around in front of him. To Ekman, who was in a berserk state, this was a blatant provocation. It let out a low roar and immediately rushed in that direction. Unfortunately, the sole white deer that Brando controlled was just an illusion. From an optical point of view, it was as fast as it could be, and as agile as it could be. Thus, the acolyte of Earth couldn't do anything about it. He hid under an old tree and held the statue of the sole white deer. It was as if he was playing a game, teasing the terrifying enemy that was just a moment ago. But when he peeked his head out and saw this scene, he couldn't help but sneer under the effect of the silent spell. Of course, it should be called a silent sneer. Since each silent spell lasted for 5 minutes, the remaining 6 spells would allow him to rest easy for 30 minutes. In addition to the 10 minutes that the Platinum Warhorse had bought him, he had a total of 40 minutes left for Nalathar. Moreover, even if the silent spell was used up, he could still use the 5 minutes of immortality provided by the unyielding innate gift to cut off his heartbeat and breathing. After that, he could bandage himself for another 5 minutes. Logically speaking, Brando believed that the Silver Elves would arrive in 50 minutes. Of course, he wouldn't joke about his own life. Without a certain degree of certainty, Brando wouldn't put his own life on the line. Time slowly ticked away. Just as Brando was about to cast the silent spell for the 4th time, he suddenly felt his heart skip a beat. Because at this moment, he noticed that Acolyte had suddenly stopped. Its attention was no longer on the sole white deer that was provoking it. The monster let out a series of low growls from its throat. Brando recognized this voice. It was a warning. Someone was coming. Who was it? Was it Nalathar? Countless thoughts flashed through Brando's mind, but he didn't dare to be careless. He immediately cast the fourth silence spell, and the remaining number of uses on the ruby instantly increased to 3. But soon, he realized that something was wrong. The monster's gaze wasn't looking towards the north. Instead, it was staring in his direction. The youth's heart skipped a beat. What's going on? He couldn't help but ask himself. But that shouldn't be the case. There shouldn't be any problems. He replayed his actions over and over again in his mind, but he couldn't find anything that he missed out on. But at this moment, with a rustling sound, Brando suddenly saw the dense forest in front of him split open, and a familiar face appeared from behind. It was a youth. No, to be more precise, it was the youth that Brando had seen before in Chablis town. But he was also the person that caused this series of events. Of course, Brando remembered his name, Eek. Eek? Lantanilon. Ophelia, and even his identity. He was the only son of Duke Lone and the future successor of the Lantanilon Duchy. But that wasn't important right now. What was important was that Eek's sudden appearance had turned the forest into a strange scene. In fact, Eek was right in front of Brando. Of course, he could see Brando hiding behind the tree, as well as the terrifying monster on the other side. At the same time, Brando could see Eek, but he couldn't see the reaction of the acolyte of Earth behind him. But he could roughly guess what was going on. Just as he guessed, the acolyte of Earth turned around and stared at the uninvited guest with its 140,000 pairs of eyes. Of course, it didn't know that there was another target behind the tree. Facing such a scene, the young man called Eek was slightly stunned. His gaze first fell on the stone armor around Ekman's body and the pair of arms that had already turned into stone. This was the sign of an elemental awakening. The youth's face turned pale, but his gaze then fell on Brando's face. He saw that Brando was looking at him with a complicated expression. In fact, Brando even had the urge to strangle him to death. As the saying goes, man proposes, God disposes. Even if you beat him to death, he would never have thought that Qin Yao Jin would appear out of nowhere. Eek hesitated for a moment, then turned his gaze back to the monster. He then pressed his sword with one hand and shouted, "You over there, big guy. What, do you want to fight me?" He immediately pulled out his sword and charged in another direction. What's going on? Brando watched as the childish youth ran away from him. With his rich experience, he could tell that the youth was trying to lure the monster away. And all of this was just for a stranger that he had met for the first time, or rather, the second time. At that moment, he felt like he had 1,000 things he wanted to say, but he couldn't say them out loud. It was as if 1,000 or 10,000 thoughts had converged into a single sentence, holy shit. This kid is a living lay phone. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 193. No matter if it was in his previous life or this one, Brando had always thought of himself as an ordinary person. The difference was that when he discovered that he had some abilities, on this basis, he naturally had greater ambitions and desires. Although this desire was to change the course of Erwin's history, to prevent the things that he regretted in the past from happening in this world. This kind of thinking had nothing to do with greatness, even if it could indirectly save many people. However, Brando did not think that he had become noble because of this. Like any other ordinary person, his desires came from his own needs and feelings. He was sure of this, and it was just like how one of his creeds was to repay kindness with kindness. He never thought that he had the responsibility to restrain himself like a saint. But at the same time, he understood the principle of returning a favor. Thus, when Eek moved, Brando reacted. "Lady Martha, I didn't offend you, did I?" He cursed in his heart while dispelling the silence spell. He then shouted at Eek, "Don't run that way, come back." The young man was stunned, but the earth god's messenger had already appeared between the two of them. The giant monster first glanced at Eek, but its gaze eventually returned to Brando. Although its brain was not very good, it could still recognize who its target was. "I say, luring my monster away without saying anything is not something a gentleman would do." Brando looked at the earth god's messenger's densely packed compound eyes. His heart was in a mess, but he could not help but maintain his dignity as he said this. To be honest, he wanted to curse the young man in front of him, but he could not help but have a good impression of the young man's actions. He was in a dilemma. After hesitating for a long time, he could only mock the young man in front of him. "Thank you." Eek only looked at Brando and smiled gratefully. In fact, he knew that if Brendel did not make a move, he would only be able to hold on for a few seconds before being torn to shreds. The difference between the strength of a gold-ranked fighter and a silver-ranked fighter was not something that could be calculated with common logic. But speaking of which, it was still his fault. He was a mercenary, so of course he knew what the young man was holding. From Brando's gesture of dispelling the spell, he could tell that it was a silent spell. This spell was often used in battles, especially during sneak attacks and infiltration, so he was not unfamiliar with it. But when he saw the silent spell, he knew that he had made a huge mistake. In other words, he was the one who had dragged the other party into danger. But even so, the young man who was covered in wounds still made a move. He let out a sigh. He was certain that the young man was a righteous knight. He had been obsessed with knight novels since he was a child. Even in his dreams, he wanted to be a chivalrous knight. Of course, becoming a mercenary was still a long way from his dream, but his belief had never changed. In fact, it was precisely because of this that he was so well liked by the Grey Wolves mercenaries. "Mr. Knight, let's defeat this monster." Eek took a deep breath and said excitedly. He knew that even if the two of them worked together, they would not be a match for the monster. But since they were going to die, they had to die a heroic death. To be able to fight side by side with a righteous knight, Eek felt that it was not a misfortune. It was Martha's appreciation of his ideals. But Brando did not understand this idea. He was slightly stunned. What? As soon as he finished speaking, he saw the monster's eyes flashing red. This was a sign that it was about to attack. Brando's body tensed up instinctively. He had already activated charge, but the next moment, he realized that the attack he was waiting for did not come. Because when Ekman turned around, Brando saw the young man taking the opportunity to slash at him. "Shit! Are you crazy?" Brando wanted to use his hands to cover his eyes. This was a horrible sight. A young man who was at most level 30 silver rank was attacking a level 65 boss without hesitation. He could almost imagine what would happen next. As expected, before Eek's sword could even reach a meter away from the earth god's emissary, a layer of rock appeared out of nowhere and blocked his attack, preventing him from advancing. This layer of rock was made up of hexagonal pieces of rock. It was one of the Earth Messenger's strongest passive skills, Rock Shield. The rock was made up of the toughest granite. There were 3 layers from top to bottom, and each layer was at least 6 centimeters thick. As long as a physical attack was within a meter of Ekman, this layer of rock shield would automatically activate. Normal physical attacks would not be able to harm the monster at all. But Eek did not know this. He knew that he was in trouble when his attack was blocked. But it was too late for him to retreat. The Earth Messenger swung its arm, and a sharp wind blade was formed from the rock. Countless rock fragments flew past and formed a second attack. At that moment, Eek thought that he was going to die. But at that moment, he felt someone ramming into him with great force, and the two of them flew to the side. The young man groaned as he fell to the ground. He opened his eyes in shock and saw that the Earth Messenger's attack had missed. He turned around with a pale face and saw Brando getting up from the other side. He immediately knew what happened. After a moment of shock, he quickly replied with gratitude, "Thank you, damn it." Brando cursed in his heart. Another charge skill was wasted. Even though Eek's character was not bad compared to Makarov and Byuga, he was still a brainless idiot. He did not know how Makarov taught the only son of Duke Lone, but from the looks of it, Eek's education as a noble was a complete failure. But the youth obviously did not know what Brendel was thinking. When he saw Brendel's silence, he thought that Brendel was thinking about how to deal with the monster. He made up his mind. If not for Brando's help, he would have died a long time ago. So he decided to be brave and said loudly, Mr. Knight. I'll hold him back, and you attack from the back." Brando did not cry. "Can't you see that it's pointless to attack from any direction? Can't you grow a brain?" However, in order to make this fellow shut up, he simply interrupted in annoyance, "Shut up. Now's not the time to talk nonsense. I'm sorry, forget it. Pretend I didn't say anything." Brando turned around, but the moment he turned around, he saw the monster charging towards him like a heavy tank. Facing the charge of a level 65 boss, he didn't dare to be careless. He immediately dodged to the left, wanting to use a frontal break on the boss from the side where it couldn't attack. He wanted to see if the armor break attack could do any damage to the rock shield. But what surprised him was that his dodge was surprisingly smooth. Logically speaking, even if Ekman's movement was slow, he shouldn't have given up on protecting his flank. He was prepared to take the hit, but he didn't expect that he would be able to escape from Ekman's attack range so easily. But he suddenly thought of another possibility and broke out in cold sweat. He turned around and saw Eek holding his sword in front of his chest, facing the acolyte of Earth head-on. Is there a need to do this? Brando gave up on using frontal break, and raised his right hand to shoot out a wind bullet. The Ring of the Wind Empress had only been charged for about 10 minutes, so it didn't have much power. However, the strong wind still disrupted Ekman's attack. Ekman's attack was supposed to hit the young man's chest, but it ended up hitting Ekman's left shoulder instead. Ekman screamed in pain as he flew backward and landed in the bushes. After a dull thud, he stopped breathing. Brando quickly took a step back and looked at the monster that was slowly turning towards him. He cursed in his heart. There was nothing he could do right now. He could only pray that Nalathar would arrive quickly. But it seemed that this wish was not realistic. Or perhaps, Martha did not hear his prayers at all. The forest was completely silent. It was as if there was only him and the oracle left in the forest. But at that moment, Brando heard a soft chuckle. The chuckle was so sudden. For Amandina, the battle became much simpler after the Roman joined the fray. Of course, Romaine was not willing to tell him how many exploding crystals she had. At first, she gave him 3 exploding crystals, and the mercenaries used explosions to chase the lizard men off the platform. However, even though the barbarians from the forest didn't seem to have fully evolved, they at least knew how to protect themselves. Under the command of their lizard man lieutenant, the green-skinned reptiles quickly spread out and charged forward once again. This time, the Roman gave them 5 exploding crystals, and shook his head to indicate that he did not have any left. Romaine was a little clever because she could hear the sound of Nalathar's horn from the other side of the battlefield. The long sound of the horn reverberated in the air above the ruins. This was the signal that they had agreed on. This meant that the battle had ended. Even though there were no reinforcements, they could at least retreat. But for Amandina, this was not the result she wanted. Thus, her order was simple. Falerne, go and grab her bag for me. The elven girl obeyed her orders, and the end result was Romaine looking at Amandina with tears in her eyes. Amandina took out 5 crystals from her bag that was filled with strange items and asked with dissatisfaction, "Why did you hide so many? These things are dangerous, didn't I tell you?" I took good care of them. Romaine replied with grievance. That's not the problem. Forget it, I'll tell you later. Amandine sighed. Falerne, distribute these exploding crystals. We're preparing to counterattack. She nodded and did as she was told. The result of the battle was obvious. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 195. The crisp laughter seemed to have penetrated the silence of the forest. But how could there be a third party in the forest? Brando and the messenger of the earth raised their heads at the same time. Only then did they realize that there was a short girl sitting on the tree. She was about 14 or 15 years old and had a pair of curly blonde ponytails. She cupped her round baby face with her hands and looked at them with interest. The girl's eyes were smiling, or rather, her emerald green eyes were filled with curiosity. She was dressed in the traditional leather attire of most adventurers, and she was shaking her leather boots. Mr. Brendel, do you need any help? She asked with a smile as she supported her face with one hand. Who are you? Brando was stunned. The girl gave him a sense of familiarity. He narrowed his eyes. Allahs, the girl replied. Allahs. The emissary of Earth let out a low roar, interrupting the conversation between the two. It was obviously displeased with the interruption of this uninvited guest, but it did not dare to act rashly because there was a trace of hidden danger on the other party. It raised its head, and its 140,000 pairs of eyes reflected the girl's existence. At the same time, it lowered its body slightly and assumed a cautious posture. This action attracted Brando's attention. You're so annoying, interrupting me. The little girl snorted softly. Then, she jumped down and a huge sword suddenly appeared in her hand. Without saying a word, she crossed her hands and swung the sword down. Ekman howled and jumped back. Its rocky forelimbs intertwined to meet the attack. However, with a crunching sound, the 3 layers of rock shields shattered like glass. Further down, the rock shields on the forelimbs shattered, and bronze blood spurted out from the cracks. However, the sword did not stop there. It went through the incision and sliced off Ekman's forelimbs. Then, it struck its chest. With a loud bang, the greatsword sent Ekman flying. At that moment, Brando was dumbfounded. The series of actions from the beginning of the attack was completed in a flash, but the moment the girl landed on the ground, the ferocious Ekman was turned into a dead dog. Wait, is that really the messenger of the earth? Why does it feel like it's even weaker than the lowest level grey wolves in Butchie? You are. Before Brendel could finish his sentence, he was stunned to see the little girl tossing the sword like a toothpick towards the acolyte of earth. There was a loud bang, and the forest fell silent once more. What a disobedient kitten. You need to be taught a lesson. The little girl clapped her hands and turned around. Because she was much shorter than Brendel, she had to raise her head to look at the tall man. What do you want to ask, Mr. Brendel? She raised her golden eyebrows and asked mischievously. Nothing. I have something to do. Brando was not an idiot. Although it looked like he was the one who was stolen, he was not an idiot. First of all, he did not have the ability to kill the messenger of the earth, but it was possible to reverse the order. Secondly, this little girl looked like a violent person. Brendel knew that there were many perverted NPCs in the game, and even though most of them had peerless hidden quests, it was better not to provoke them. After all, there was a chance to restart in the game, but not here. Thus, he quickly bid farewell to avoid getting himself into trouble. Unfortunately, this trouble came knocking on his door. Wait, the little girl saw that Brendel was really going to leave and reached out to grab the corner of his shirt, but there was a tearing sound. She looked at the leather armor in her hand and stuck out her tongue. I'm sorry, I think I used too much strength. Brando had no choice but to throw the leather armor to the ground. He sighed and turned around to ask, do I know you, Miss Alaz? Of course. You even accepted such a valuable gift from others. Wait, I don't understand. What gift? Alaz pointed at his backpack. You mean, the girl nodded. Brando's face sank. The golden apple would not have entered his backpack for no reason. He already had his suspicions, but he did not have a suspect. He even suspected Romans and whom he had never met before, especially after meeting the scholar Tolman. His suspicions towards the former increased day by day. But he never thought that it would be such a little girl. He looked at the girl who was as playful as a doll and could not believe it. Do you know what it is? A fairy's apple. Is it that rare? As expected. So you were also in that place. Yeah, Mr. Brando, you are so suspicious of me. Of course I know that place, the Valley of the Saints. You humans call that place the legacy of the king, right? You humans, Brando caught the word. But he had basically believed the little girl's words. When he was in the Valley of the Saints, even he himself did not know that he had such an item in his backpack. So Allah's words were at least 90% credible. Then, why did you give me this? Brando thought for a moment, opened his backpack and took out the golden apple. He held the apple in his hand and asked the question that had been on his mind for a long time. The golden apple was not an ordinary thing. In folklore, the golden apple came from the fruit of the tree of gold. Because it was born from the water of the river of fate, it also contained the power to change a person's fate. I don't think I know you, Miss Alaz. The short girl snickered, her eyes curved into crescents, and said with a smile, of course there is a reason. Consider it a thank you gift. Thank you gift. Alaz nodded. Brando was speechless. Why do I feel like this is a big trouble? That's exactly why I want to thank you, Mr. Brando. So this time you saved me also to thank me. What kind of trouble is this? But I don't think I've done anything that offends the heavens. He thought for a long time and could not figure it out, but Alaz did not look like she was lying to him. Or rather, there was no need to tease him with a golden apple. A golden apple as a thank you gift, how big was this trouble? The young man could not help but feel a little gloomy for a moment. That's not it. Alaz shook her head, her pair of golden ponytails swinging playfully. Brando looked at her. I have a question to ask you, but I haven't decided whether to ask or not. Because if I ask, I get the pleasure of the answer, but if I don't ask, I get the pleasure of guessing. So annoying, so contradictory. But if that naughty kitten kills you, won't I lose a kind of pleasure? The short girl said to herself, no way, no way. So. No, I've changed my mind. I've just thought about it, I've decided to ask you this question. Damn, Ekman, you died for nothing. Why does it sound like I'm in a bad mood today, so I'm going to cause trouble for you? Why does it sound like those unreasonable dragons that are unpopular everywhere in Vaunt? I'm not in a good mood today, so I'm going to cause trouble for you. But he could not help but ask, if that's the case, then as you said, won't you lose the pleasure of guessing? Didn't I say I changed my mind? Well, what do you want to ask? Alaz pointed at the apple in his hand. Is it related to this? Brando was stunned. Mr. Brando, you should know the value of this, the fairy's apple. Don't you want to eat it, Mr. Brando? Brando shook his head. His own plan was clear. But the girl's attitude made him suspicious. He could not help but look at the apple in his hand. Could it be a fake? Or was there some other mystery behind it? I don't believe that there's such a thing as a free lunch. Are you worried that I'm lying to you? Don't worry, I didn't put poison in it this time. I just added something interesting, the short girl replied. Brando broke out in cold sweat. He was glad that he was on his guard. What is it? He asked, but Alaz did not seem to want to answer. He saw her running to the side of the Earth Messenger's corpse and dragging it out. Just like that, she used one hand to grab the Earth Messenger's hind leg and dragged it out as if she was dragging a dead dog. She fiddled with the corpse for a while before throwing a longbow and muttering to herself, "Strange, why is the mana loss so great? Damn it, don't touch the corpse, you unlucky bastard." Brando could not help but scream in his mind. Mana loss was a setting in the game. When the owner of the magic item died, the magic power of the magic item would dissipate along with the disappearance of the spirit traction. The magic equipment could also be damaged because of this. Therefore, when you kill a monster, you may not be able to obtain all the equipment on its body. As for how much you can obtain, it depends on luck. Or to borrow a gaming term, it depends on how unlucky you are. Brando used to be the unlucky bastard in the guild. Of course, there was someone who was even more unlucky than him, and that was his senior. Brando's own unlucky streak was built within the system, but he thought that his senior's unlucky streak was already beyond the system's halo. There were many times when she forcefully opened the corpse, but the result was that all of the magical items were lost. But things went south. Brando was unlucky, but at least he knew his own limits. His senior, on the other hand, was obsessed with opening corpses. It was as if her life's goal was to defeat the unlucky bastard. But as the saying goes, fate is unbeatable. Thus, her challenge ended in a shameful failure. But today, Brando once again witnessed the birth of another unlucky bastard who was almost as unlucky as him. This was a level 55 boss with perfect storyline. It was almost 30 levels higher than the corpse of a boss with perfect storyline. The first item she got from the corpse was actually a bow. In fact, the Acolyte of Earth's loot list was only a bow. It was a brass grade shale longbow. Don't be like this. What happened to the strength of the mountains? Brando could not help but cry. P.S. Thank you, everyone. I'm really happy to see everyone's praise and support. Thank you, everyone. I'll work hard to repay everyone's kindness by writing more chapters. Chapter 196. The little girl squatted beside Ekman's corpse, which was as tall as a mountain. She placed one hand on her knee while the other fiddled with the corpse for a long time. She did not seem to have found anything. She hooked the string of the bow with her finger and waved it in front of Brando. Do you want it? You don't want it. Alaz shook her head, her golden ponytail swaying. It's useless to me, I just want to see what it is. Brando felt like crying. If you don't want it, then you should stay away from the corpse. He felt like he was going crazy, but she was the one who killed the Acolyte of Earth, and he had no right to complain. That's all. What's all? Just this bow. How could that be? There are many other things. But they don't fit my taste, so I'm too lazy to touch them. The little girl answered. What kind of reason is that? Brando thought to himself, but he still asked. You haven't answered my question. What did you put on the golden apple? As a thank you gift, I think I have the right to know, right? He pointed at the golden apple in his hand. He wanted to give it to Freya or the Roman, but he decided against it. Only the heavens knew what was on the golden apple. Thinking of this, he could not help but put the golden apple further away, so as not to touch the interesting thing on it. It's a secret. The little girl laughed. A secret. Brando wanted to ask more, but he saw Alaz's expression change slightly. She suddenly looked to the side. She put her index finger to her lips and made a shoot gesture to Brando. Someone's coming. She became serious and whispered. Mr. Brando, your adventures are very exciting, I like it. But this time, I came to you because something happened in my clan. Fu Luofa and I have to go back. I hope you'll take care of yourself. Wait. Brando was stunned. He suddenly thought of a possibility from the little girl's words. Could it be that this guy had been following him? His expression became a little strange, but even so, Brando did not lose his sharp instincts. He immediately found a loophole in the other party's words. Tribe? You are. Alaz nodded with a smile. Brando felt as if he had been struck by lightning. He was speechless. If he remembered correctly, there was only one type of creature in Wone that was not human and liked to use the word race to refer to their own race. That was the dragon race that no one, including the undead of Madara, liked. This race, which claimed to be superior creatures, was usually high and mighty, always did not do anything, and was unreasonable, was notorious. But he didn't expect that his prophecy would come true, and that he would really interact with such a little female dragon for so long. But fortunately, at least the other party was not in a bad mood and ate him for lunch, although it was a little late for lunch at this time. But in fact, Brando also felt that Alaz seemed to have a good impression of him. If he really had a dragon as his backer, Brando could not help but feel a little lucky for a moment. What kind of virtue did he have? Well, Mr. Brando, those people will be here soon. I don't want those inferior creatures, stupid things to see me. I'm right by your side. Don't worry, I won't let them hurt you. She stood on tiptoe and patted him on the shoulder in a mature manner, as if she was his big sister. Then, half of her body disappeared into the air, and gradually her whole body became transparent and disappeared without a trace. Hurt me? Did Nalathar and the others have to do that? Brando thought that she was talking about Nalathar and the others, thinking that the always arrogant silver elves were inferior creatures and stupid things. He did not know how to feel. He guessed that the Silver Elf King would be so angry that he would come back to life after hearing that. But what she said was not wrong. The dragon race was one of the few races in Wone that maintained a relatively pure golden bloodline. Just in terms of bloodline alone, they were much stronger than the Iron and Silver Elves. Moreover, the most abnormal thing about the dragon race was that although their fertility was low, any of their descendants were born with elemental power, which was one of the most prominent characteristics of the golden bloodline. But Nalathar came too late. He complained as he limped towards the corpse, thinking that since he had already been tainted by the unlucky hand aura once, he was not afraid of being tainted again. And maybe if he was lucky, a negative would turn into a positive, right? He first picked up the bow and looked at it in his vision, and found that it was indeed a shale longbow, magic, penetration, 25 to 29, plus 4 dexterity, plus 2 strength. Activation, creates a petrifying arrow, 1 week cooldown. Brando weighed the bow in his hand, and was somewhat satisfied with the attributes. Although the shale longbow only had a brass tag, and its attributes were only at the level of a level 40 equipment, the activation was very useful. The petrifying arrow was one of the few magic arrows that could not be created with magic. Its effect was to petrify the enemy, and the degree of petrification depended on the enemy's constitution. Generally speaking, an opponent below silver ranked would be turned into a stone statue. Of course, Brendel would not use such a precious petrifying arrow against an iron-ranked opponent. This arrow was a serious threat even to silver-ranked opponents, and it could even affect gold-ranked opponents. Like other magic arrows, the petrifying arrow would not lose its effectiveness over time, at least for a short period of time. Therefore, it could be stored for players, and many archer players had prepared it to store petrifying arrows. Magic arrows did not have to be shot with a bow anyway. Although the shale longbow was not bad, it was still not comparable to the loot of a level 55 boss with a perfect rating. Hence, he couldn't wait to look at Ekman's huge corpse. Even though he knew that Alaz was still by his side, as a player, it was an irresistible temptation to be able to find the equipment of his dreams from a pile of unknown loot. He put the golden apple by his feet, and pulled out a necklace from under the corpse. Star of Flame, magic, increases the capacity of the fire element pool by half, increases the fire element by 10. Brando looked at the brass-grade necklace, and could not help but laugh. It seemed that being unlucky had its benefits. This necklace was the best item for a fire elementalist. If he had gotten this necklace from a boss in the past, he would have dragged the design team of Torrential Rain out to give them a good beating. This was because whether it was a 50% increase in the capacity of the fire element pool or a 10% increase in the damage of the fire element spells, it was useless to a warrior. But it was different now. Although the latter attribute was useless to him, the 50% increase in the capacity of the fire element pool was too important for a useless elementalist like him. But the real significance of this necklace was that it opened up a new path for him. Brando had always been troubled by the fact that his elemental pool was too small, but the Star of Flame made him realize that for a useless elementalist like him, he could definitely equip the equipment of an elementalist. For example, the Star of Flame, Harsh Winter, and even the legendary Asilica, Elemental Brooch. With these equipment, increasing the capacity of the elemental pool by a few times was a simple matter. No matter how bad his elemental sensing ability was, he could still be transformed into a qualified elementalist. This was the so-called lack of talent made up for by equipment. Brando kept the necklace and heard a soft sound behind him. He turned around and saw a group of people walking out from behind the bushes. Brando couldn't help but be startled when he saw them, and the phrase "enemies are destined to meet" flashed through his mind. It was none other than Makarov, Byuga, and the others who trapped him here. Of course, it wasn't just the two of them. There were 7 to 8 people following them, but they didn't look like the Grey Wolves mercenaries. Brando's gaze was focused on the old man between the two of them. He furrowed his brows and felt that he had seen this old man somewhere before. But compared to Brendel's surprise, Byuga and Makarov's surprise was even greater. It could even be said that they were stunned. In fact, they were stunned when they saw Brando. They had already recognized this young man, but Brando looked a little valiant at the moment. He held his dagger in one hand as he sat on the bloodied corpse of Ekman. His body was also covered in blood and he gave off the impression that he was a ruthless man. This young man went through a tough battle and killed the monster all by himself. Byuga and Makarov had personally experienced the battle a few days ago, and of course, they had fought Ekman as well. A level 55 boss's strength was close to a level 70 monster, and Byuga and Makarov were no match for it. Moreover, Ekman and Byuga's elemental field could be said to be of the same origin. The awkward thing about having the same elemental field was that once they fought, it would only depend on the difference in strength. However, the difference in strength was obvious. As a result, both sides were defeated the moment they clashed, causing the Grey Wolves mercenaries to be annihilated. That was why Byuga and Makarov's eyes couldn't help but shrink back when they saw the corpse. "This young man, it's you." Byuga was the first to speak. "Oh, it's you guys." Brando turned around to look at them and replied lazily. At the same time, he snickered inwardly. This was what they meant by karma. Lady Martha actually arranged for you to meet me here. You can only blame yourselves for being unlucky. What a joke. If he didn't pay back this time, how could he be called a veteran player? He might as well go home and plant sweet potatoes. After saying this, he calmly looked at this group of people. Thus, when Byuga opened his mouth, he was met with an awkward silence. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidien.com. There are more chapters. Support the author and support the original reading. Translator, Endless Fantasy Translation Editor, Endless Fantasy Translation. Chapter 197. After he finished speaking, he looked at the group of people with a calm and unruffled expression. The forest was silent for a moment. Mr. Brando, are you all right? However, Makarov was an experienced old fox after all. After calming himself down, he asked, I didn't expect to meet you here after we got separated from each other. You old bastard, you're still trying to push the blame to Conrad. Do you really think I'm a fool? Brando thought. Of course, he didn't reveal any resentment on his face. He patted the lifeless head of the Earth God emissary and replied, naturally, this little thing isn't enough to cause trouble for me. It's a pity that you escaped too quickly that night. I wanted to help my allies but I couldn't. I'm really sorry. Both sides gritted their teeth. His ability to lie through his teeth seemed to be on par with the other, but Brendel's behavior still made Makarov wary. He was a little unsure if Brendel really knew the whole truth, or if he was just angry because they pretended to be nice to him at the beginning. But there weren't many people at his age who could be so shrewd. Makarov couldn't help but feel troubled. He even ignored the sarcasm in Brando's words. Moreover, he didn't come here to bicker with the young man. He frowned and looked at the forest behind Brando. He hesitated for a moment and asked, Mr. Brando, did you see anyone else pass by here? You're talking about a young man. Brendel smiled to himself. Yes. When Makarov's words left his mouth, Brendel could feel the people behind him becoming more anxious. If I'm not wrong, that's Mr. Eek, right? Brando asked. Makarov, Bugge, and the old man's expression changed. You've seen him. Makarov took a step forward and blurted out. But he quickly realized that he was overreacting. He coughed and stood back. He looked at the two people beside him. Bugge had one hand on his sword hilt the entire time. His face was gloomy as he maintained his vigilance. The old man was looking at Brendel's direction with a pensive expression. But he immediately realized that Brando might have guessed something. However, he believed that it was impossible for Brando to know their identities. After all, even the Grey Wolves mercenaries and Eek didn't know about this. Have you seen him, Mr. Brando? Makarov coughed and asked. Eek is the descendant of an important friend of mine. I promised him that I would take good care of him, but I didn't expect to be separated from him. Brando smiled. Eek wasn't the only one who got separated from you. Wasn't there also the entire Grey Wolves mercenaries? Why don't you, this old fox, be so anxious? However, he didn't point this out. Instead, he asked, old friend. So that's how the cunning fox Makarov, or Baron Locker, addressed Duke Lone. I'm afraid the Duke won't agree. As soon as he spoke, he heard the clashing of swords and sabers. Brendel raised his head and looked at the row of subordinates behind Makarov who had unsheathed their swords. Young man, who are you? Makarov's expression changed as he asked sternly. He immediately thought that Brando might be on the same side, but looking at the acolyte of the earth lying on the ground, it didn't seem likely. Could it be a third party? The cunning fox hesitated for a moment. Although it wasn't impossible, who else would be interested in this competition? He couldn't help but wonder if it was a foreign force. Madara or Cruz? Brando naturally didn't know that many thoughts were running through his mind, but he didn't intend to answer. He was waiting for someone to speak. It was the old man between Makarov and Bugge. Since he was standing in front of these two, it meant that he had a high status. But who was this old man who suddenly appeared? Duke Lone. No, Duke Lone was an important figure, but it didn't look like a disguise either. In Woned, disguises were a skill that players could learn, but most of the time, there would be flaws. As an old player, Brando knew this. Sure enough, after waiting for a while, the old man finally turned his gaze to him. However, the first question he asked stunned everyone. Young man, is that a fairy's apple by your feet? The old man asked after confirming it for a while. Shit! Brando cursed in his heart and realized that he had forgotten to keep it in his inventory. Usually, He would not have made such a low-level mistake, but on one hand, Allah's previous words had weakened his expectations of this thing, and on the other hand, because he had a strong backer behind him, he did not think too much about it, and to be honest, he did not expect this group of people to appear first. But at the same time, he finally recognized who this old man was. The chief court wizard of Erewhon, an elder who served Anson VII for 3 generations, Fleetwood. Hadwilla. Gemmer. This guy is the mentor of the current princess and the little prince. So he's here as well. I didn't expect Makarov to have such a hidden chess piece. No wonder he was so confident in leaving Yeek in Chablis, as if he was leaving Yeek to fend for himself. Even I was almost fooled. But in this way, this fellow's intentions were even more obvious. From the looks of it, everything that the Grey Wolves mercenaries were facing was very likely planned by this old fox. Was his goal just to not drag things out? Brendel could not help but grip the hilt of his dagger. Even though he agreed with the values of these nobles who were extremely utilitarian, but to play with the feelings of the people they interacted with day and night, or perhaps they did not even care about those people. Be it Samford or Scarlet, everything they went through was the meaning of their lives. They fought hard for it, sacrificed for it, but to the people in front of them, it was like an abstract illusion that didn't exist. But when they no longer needed this facade, the dreams of those insignificant people in their eyes burst like bubbles. With a gentle poke, they couldn't even resist. Scarlet and the others probably didn't even understand this. Brando took a deep breath and gritted his teeth. He was determined to teach these people a lesson. It wasn't because he was a righteous person, but because he was in a bad mood right now. He was in a bad mood, and he had the ability to do so. That was why he wanted Makarov, Bugha, and even this old man to pay the price for what they did to Scarlet and Samford. Master Fleetwood, right? Brando picked up the golden apple and waved it in front of everyone. His action caused Makarov and Bugha's expression to change. They finally understood what Fleetwood meant by the fairy's apple. That was the fruit of the golden tree. With Martha above, they had the power to change everything. The old king's body was like a candle in the wind, or the weak prince's fate. With the golden apple, everything could be changed. Was this the chance the heavens gave to Erewhon? Everyone couldn't help but think so. Even someone as shrewd as Sly Fox couldn't help but turn pale, and his breathing grew ragged. Even Fleetwood, who had experienced countless storms in his life, couldn't help but speak. Young man, the thing in your hand is very important to us. May I ask if you are willing to sell it to us? We can pay you any price you want, be it money or power. Brando felt 2 slender hands on his shoulders. A small voice asked with a smile, "Do you want to sell it to them, Mr. Brando?" "I'll allow it." Brando only smiled and looked at them coldly. He raised the golden apple and asked, "You want this?" "That's right," Makarov continued, "Mr. Brando, the thing in your hand is very important to us. It is so important that it can change the fate of many people. Trust me, we don't want to buy it out of selfishness. We are also willing to follow the principle of fair trade. As long as you give us a price, we will do our best to satisfy you. Be it money, women, or power, anything you want." Makarov's words were provocative. Brendel's mouth twitched in disdain, and he sneered, "What arrogance! What are you going to use to guarantee all of this? Why should I trust you, Mr. Makarov? With the power of the Erewhon royal family behind you. You ask me what I want. Fine, I want to ask you 2 questions. 2 questions. Makarov, Bugha, and Fleetwood looked at each other. What kind of request was this? But it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, so he nodded. Go ahead. The first question is something I'm curious about. I don't understand your plan. Grandmaster Fleetwood is here, so why would Mr. Makarov and Mr. Bugha risk their lives? Even the Grey Wolves mercenaries that you've been building for 10 years will be destroyed because of this. I don't understand. Makarov and Byuga didn't expect this question and were stunned. But it was Fleetwood who coughed and replied in a low voice, "Young man, this matter isn't as simple as it seems. I don't know how much you know, but we don't want the outside world to know that the royal family is involved in this matter." He did not want to explain so much to a stranger, but it seemed like Brendel had recognized him, and the item in his hand was too important, so the old man had no choice but to lower his stance and explain it to him. "I see." Brando nodded. "So, the second question is, are you guys here to reunite the Grey Wolves mercenaries?" Brando chuckled. "Actually, I've recruited some of your men." Makarov and Fleetwood looked at each other and shook their heads. "No, Mr. Brando, you're overthinking it. We're only here to chase after Mr. Eek because he insisted on looking for his companions and fiancé." He couldn't help but feel a little awkward when talking about his fiancé. After all, it was quite embarrassing to talk about the fiancé of the Duke's only son. But that was it. He shook his head and continued, "As for the Grey Wolves mercenaries, it's already a thing of the past. It no longer exists. I'll thank you on behalf of the men you recruited." As expected. Brando gritted his teeth. Then, he heard a clang. Everyone turned around and saw a red-haired girl standing there in a daze. She covered the wound on her chest with one hand and was covered in blood. The spear in her hand had fallen to the ground at some point. P.S. My hand slipped in the last scene, and I forgot to change the chapter name. Sorry. But for some reason, my subscriptions have dropped again. Please subscribe. Chapter 198. Scarlet. Makarov was startled and looked at Brando bitterly. He finally understood why Brando had asked that question. But this was a crucial moment and Fleetwood would not allow him to make this young man unhappy. Even if his members were to be alienated in front of him, he could only grit his teeth and swallow his anger. However, this punch came quickly and fiercely. Even with his mental fortitude, he couldn't help but turn his head away when faced with the disbelieving, questioning gaze of the young girl he had raised with his own hands. Even if he had 1,000 excuses to explain himself, even if he knew that this girl who he treated as his adopted daughter hoped that he could at least explain himself, he couldn't say a single word at this moment. Everyone present could feel the power of the heart of gold pulsating in her body. He did not know what happened to her that caused her power to rise so quickly. He thought that it was because of her potential in a life and death situation. This meant that she was at least a genius that they had neglected. But on the other side, the golden tree in Brando's hand was also emitting the power of the heart of gold. That was the origin of the golden bloodline. Eating it would give one the destiny of being chosen by the heavens. Makarov's explanation was stuck in his throat, but when he opened his mouth, it became, "Scarlet, what are you?" His words seemed to drain all the strength of the young girl. She looked straight at the man who had so long occupied the place of a father in her heart, and there was not so much disappointment in her eyes as in a deep entreaty that she would believe even a single lie of happiness. She was as helpless as a foolish daughter, waiting for her heartless father to change his mind. She hoped that he would turn around and say, "Sorry, welcome back," but all she got was a tactful reply. It sounded like he was concerned, but it was as if he had distanced himself from her like a stranger. The tall figure in her memory seemed to have become distant and blurry. She clutched her chest with one hand and tears burst out of her eyes. "I'm sorry, why?" She whimpered like an injured animal. She lost the last bit of her strength and knelt on the ground. Her eyes closed and she fell forward with a loud bang. He lost consciousness. Seeing this scene, Makarov couldn't say a word. Brando looked at him coldly. He felt someone gently nudging him from behind. The young man nodded to show that he understood. If it wasn't for the dragon girl Arnaz, he wouldn't have been able to detect Scarlet's arrival. Perhaps he already knew what Makarov's answer would be, but even so, he wanted Scarlet to understand that the truth was not charity. However, he couldn't allow Makarov to continue playing chess with him. "I'm sorry." Brando sighed. He stood up, walked over to help Scarlet up and wiped the dirt off her face. The girl showed her weak side in her sleep. Her tear-stained face was a little pale, but she was as serene as an angel. The young man straightened her body and leaned her against an AB's tree. Then, he turned around and looked at everyone with a condescending gaze. "Mr. Brando." Fleetwood interrupted when he saw Makarov's unstable emotions. "Makarov." Brando interrupted. The anger in his chest was finally released, and his voice was as cold as a blade. Everyone was stunned. They didn't understand why Brando's attitude suddenly changed, but the young man shouted angrily, "Don't think that I don't know where you came from. Ever since Anson VII, Aween has been declining day by day. The light in the darkness seems to be floating up and down in the chaos. It is obscure and dim, and the time seems to be fleeting. 10 years ago, you seized every opportunity to turn defeat into victory, throwing in all the chess pieces like gamblers. The entire plan was meticulous, ruthless, and seemed logical, but all of this was nothing more than a plot to overthrow Duke Arek, who had absolute power. You deceived the world so that the world would not think that the muddle-headed old Duke Anthony was just trying to preserve everything in the end. Who else is helping you, Civic?" Brando's words were like sharp swords that pierced into everyone's hearts. Makarov and Fleetwood's faces turned pale. They even forgot to breathe at that moment. They only had time to guess who this young man was. The young man had already pointed out the outline of their plan. They believed that this was a sacred and all-or-nothing operation. All sacrifices were worth it. If necessary, they would even give up their lives. Political conflict had become a fanatical belief. Just like what Brando said, there was only one chance. As long as they seized it and waited for the moment to turn defeat into victory, the light of dawn would sweep away all the darkness. This legendary story had a legendary ending. However, they didn't think that this plan would fall into the eyes of an unfamiliar young man. They didn't even miss a single detail. This plan was first set 10 years ago, and some of the details were unknown even to the subsequent participants. Then this young man who used the name Brando, who was he? What was he planning? The more Brando spoke, the angrier he got. He stood up straight like a sharp blade, his voice as cold as the winter. "You think you can represent the righteousness of the royal family, and your swords fight for the future of this country. Unfortunately, your stupidity doesn't allow you to see the truth. If you fail, can you still send others to their deaths?" "Wait," Fleetwood frowned slightly. He was a little annoyed. Although this young man held something very important to them, their plan couldn't be blasphemed because it represented the glory of the royal family. "What are you trying to say, Grandmaster Fleetwood?" Brando asked coldly. "Everything you've said is based on a hypothesis. You want to know the truth." Brando sneered. He raised his head and couldn't help but take a deep breath. At this moment, it was as if another soul was standing beside him. The young man's eyes seemed to see through the shackles of the world. Sophie's words returned to the other side of his soul. Time and space collapsed in front of him. But after everything calmed down, he saw everything in the past. Palaces and cities burned in the flames. The kingdom was overturned. Everything he was familiar with was gone. The wish of Her Royal Highness. The vow of the Valkyrie. This kingdom seemed to be reborn from the flames. Every player put in all their effort to fight for it. But in the face of the invasion of Madara's undead and the black tide of players, they were all defeated. It was as if it was a destined failure and a tragic ending. However, these nobles were still here controlling the fate of this country. It was as if they could see the final outcome, the victory they believed in. Then, like a cold grim reaper, they clung to the lives in their hands and threw them into the frenzied sacrifice. The nameless lives flowed out like the cold blood in these people's bodies. They died in exchange for a cold ending. But no one would take responsibility for it. The players remembered the dark humor, but what about these high and mighty nobles? They just changed the chessboard and continued their game. They were always sacred, representing light or darkness, justice or kindness. This belief was not to be blasphemed. Just like the blood of a noble family, it was unquestionable, on the surface. How do I tell you the truth? Brando sighed tiredly and waved his hand. Just like this golden apple in my hand. Of course, I know how it works for you, because its appearance makes your game more brilliant. It's like a shining weight that tilts the scales in your favor. That's what you think. Unfortunately, it's not that I want to discourage you. No matter what, your failure is destined. He replied. What did you say? This time, even Bugge couldn't help but frown. Young man, not everyone can become a seer. Fleetwood shook his head. But those witches who used rumors to bewitch people were all tied to the stake. Makarov added as he looked at Brando coldly. Brando smiled. Indeed, but he was the one who could foresee their failure. No, he was the one who saw it. But he wouldn't say that. He only asked, you don't believe me? Reason? Bugge asked simply. I remember, during Erwin's most glorious era. Erwin's knight held the swallowtail flag and bugle horns. When the bugle horn blew, the kingdom's blade charged forward. I remember that the battlefield was a sea of flags, embroidered with the golden coat of arms of Corvado, Grenoires, and Erech. I remember that the nobles of that era still kept their oath. Brando smiled. Do you remember that oath? Everyone was stunned. You don't remember? Brando's eyes were full of disdain. It's fine, I can read it to you. Under this sword, I swear the sage's oath. I vow to lead my people away from strife and slaughter, away from the arrogance and greed of the nobles of the empire. I vow to not repeat the cold-blooded mistakes of history. I vow to make the nobles of this new kingdom follow the spirit of chivalry. I vow to be just and strict, honest and brave, kind and generous. I vow to keep it with all my strength. Brendel read out the words forcefully, then looked at the group of people who were speechless for a moment. Do you remember who made this oath? He asked softly. Fleetwood, Makarov, and Bugge looked at each other, their faces burning. Of course they knew. How could they not know? They had simply forgotten about it. Yes, Brando nodded. This is the origin of all your beliefs, the foundation of the nobles of Erwin. Your late king and the benevolent first king, King Eric, made this oath under the Lionheart. Do you remember what he said? If one day, the nobles of Erwin forget their duty, then this sword will return to where it came from and will no longer protect this kingdom. Do you still remember? You don't remember, right? That's a pity. Brando sighed and looked at the forest. The afternoon sun shone through the forest. At this moment, the forest in the south looked so peaceful for the first time. P.S. I'll take note of the problem some students have with the plot, and I'll speed it up. If you want to know what's to come, please log on to www.chidian.com and read more chapters. Support the author, support legal reading. Chapter 199. The young man's words lingered for a long time. No one dared to make a sound. His words pierced into the deepest parts of their hearts, and they couldn't help but lower their heads to think, were their actions really as noble as they claimed? Even the strong-willed people like Fleetwood and Makarov couldn't help but waver for a moment. Yes, wasn't that glorious era the foundation of Erwin's kingdom? But they quickly stabilized their confidence and calmed down. Although the late king's ideals were noble, the situation today is different," the scholarly old man sighed. "In the end, we can't give up on what we should do just because of a possibility. Ideals cannot change reality." Makarov coldly replied. "That's why you use the same arrogance and indifference to deal with another group of arrogant nobles. But in reality, you are no different." Brando retorted with the same cold tone, "Be it the royal family or the nobles, none of you can truly change Erewhon. That's why you are destined to fail. You may have defeated your opponents, but can you defeat Madara? Cut the crap." Makarov's voice sounded like he was grinding his teeth. How can a divided kingdom resist an external enemy? Furthermore, this has nothing to do with you. Now, please fulfill your promise and give us the golden apple. Brando sneered and mentioned the golden apple. "This is the fairy's apple, the most precious fruit from the golden tree. Legend has it that it can change a person's fate, but it's a pity." Brando looked at Scarlet with a sad expression. "It can't change a country's fate. Maybe someone can change it, but that person is definitely not you. What you acknowledge will only be an obstacle to her. That's why." Brando put the fairy's apple back into his bag in front of everyone. "You won't get it. Bastard!" Makarov roared. His chest was filled with anger from being toyed with. Although he had expected this outcome, the contempt in Brando's attitude towards them really ignited his anger. This cunning fox, advisor of the royal faction, had lost his rationality and regained his identity as the former leader of the Grey Wolves mercenaries. A long sword appeared in his hand. Clang! A metallic sound rang out. Brando didn't retreat a single step. His expression didn't change, and he stared at Makarov's sword without blinking. However, between Cunning Fox's blade and the tip of the young man's nose, a hexagonal shield of light appeared. Layers of mysterious spells and runes flashed in the shield and then disappeared. String magic. And it was the most ancient kind. As a court wizard, Fleetwood's expression immediately turned ugly, as if he had seen a ghost. Ancient magic. The old man almost squeezed these words out of his throat. He looked at Brando with a changing expression, not knowing what to say for a moment. In this world, there was only one race that still used such ancient magic laws. The dragon race. Brando thanked the laws in his heart, and then calmly admired Makarov's pale face. "You are..." Cunning Fox's throat moved. Brando was about to mock him, but at this moment, he suddenly heard Allah's telepathic voice. "Mr. Brando, what you said just now seemed to have resonated with something. This power, it's so strange. I can't suppress it anymore." "What?" "That sentence." Brando was stunned. "The part where we made the vow." "No, I have to release the barrier," Allah said in a hurry. "Hey, wait." Brando was about to ask her to hold on for a while so that he could be mentally prepared. Suddenly, he felt a tremor from the deepest part of his heart. It was not the prank of the dragon girl Allah's, nor was it the mysterious resonance between the planeswalker and the cards. It was more like a sense of recognition, as a broad mind entered his thoughts. At that moment, it was as if the brightest light was produced in the darkness, and in this light, a door was opened. He seemed to have passed through the door, and saw the White Knight Ebden and the Earth Knight Gerald standing beside him. They nodded and smiled at him as if they were humans, and their eyes were full of encouragement and recognition. But the illusion only lasted for a brief moment before disappearing. Brendel finally regained his senses and found the source of the tremors. He subconsciously reached for the philosopher's slate in his pouch, but it was too late. He could feel the philosopher's slate buzzing in his hand as if it had a life of its own. The next moment, the clouds above the Chablis hills parted. This afternoon. From the Northwind Forest to Lake Venerin, from the Golden Flame Castle to Rhoda in the Shire, and even from as far away as Bragg's, everyone who lived in this area witnessed this miracle. Above the blue sky, with a point in the south as the center, the platinum clouds parted layer by layer, like a stone thrown into a calm pool, and radiated outwards in all directions. After the last bit of cloud was cleared away, the blue sky was like a pure sapphire with a magnificent light purple color, and not a speck of dust could be seen. The townsfolk, the clerics, adventurers, and even the astrologers of the Council of Stars and Moon were alerted. Far away in the Sea of Death, the Wizard of Bugha also recorded this phenomenon in Drala. The monks of the Lion's Heart Palace came out in full force. The recorder of the Black Tower was stunned and accidentally dropped his favorite crystal ball, and the pilgrims of the Thunder Gate could not help but kneel down and pray to the heavens. Everyone raised their heads and looked at the round, vacuum-like sky in the south, but only a few people understood what was really happening there. The divine artifact's reaction. The light in the forest suddenly brightened up, and the darkness was swept away. Bugha, Makarov, and Fleetwood's expression changed drastically as they looked up at the sky. After the platinum-colored clouds dispersed layer by layer, what was left was the breathtakingly beautiful purple-blue sky. There were layers of magnificent and beautiful patterns that resembled gears, and each circle had a diameter of nearly 100,000 meters. That was the Tiamat, the law that Mother Marcia had set down to restrain the elements, worlds, and magic in the myths. It was also where the boundary of the elemental world was. No matter from which angle the mortals looked at this huge and intricate creation barrier, they would feel a sense of hopelessness from the bottom of their heart, and a sense of grandeur that came from the bottom of their heart. Brando held on tightly to the stone slab as if it was about to break free. He could not help but look up at the sky. The beautiful edge of Tiamat was sliding layer by layer against the background of the blue sky, and every time it slid, it would sweep across hundreds of kilometers of the sky. However, the curve that represented the law and the straight line were merging together again, and when the layers of the gears merged together and one of the centers was aimed at this area, the forest was silent for a moment. The wind stopped blowing. If this was in the game, Brando would have goosebumps when he saw this strange scene. This scene was very similar to the scene where the elemental lords or legendary wizards cast the highest level spells, the scene where level 14 spells were cast. These spells were forbidden spells in the usual sense, or legendary spells. These spells were beyond the understanding of mortals. In fact, each of them directly mobilized the supreme law to destroy and eliminate in a destructive manner. In terms of destructive power, they were no weaker than the nuclear weapons of the original world. But at this moment, he also felt goosebumps. The resonance in his heart finally reached its peak at this moment. There was a slight tremor in the center of the circular vacuum field in the sky, but when the tremor spread in all directions, a white beam of light descended from the sky. Far away in Dorora, one of the 12 leaders of the Bugha Wizards, William Peaster held his magic quill in one hand. The tip of the quill stood motionless on the parchment filled with runes for a long time. Even the ink had soaked through the expensive lambskin, forming a small black dot on the parchment. Then, the elder just stared out of the silver grating arch window. Between the sky and the sea, a silver beam of light stood straight. This is Eric's Lionheart sword. A beam of light pierced through the clouds. It zigzagged as it passed through the boundary of the elemental realm, and then fell vertically to the other side of Erewhon. These two beams of light reflected each other in the clear afternoon sky. At this moment, everyone lost the ability to speak. But Brando just wanted to die. He just occasionally pretended to be righteous, and he did not expect to get the approval of merciful Eric by accident. If he had known, he would not have read the damn oath. He had forgotten that he had accepted the quest from the White Knight Ebden. In a moment of excitement, he further inspired the quest. Of course, the inspiration quest was not strange, but what made him want to bang his head on the ground was that it triggered the divine artifact's reaction. Wait a minute, Lady Martha. Isn't the Lionheart sword a fantasy weapon? How did it trigger the divine artifact's reaction? When did it become a divine artifact? The forum said that this weapon was a gold-tier fantasy weapon, and judging from its history, it should be true. After all, it was impossible for a kingdom like Erewhon to keep a divine artifact. This thought flashed through Brando's mind. However, the strange phenomenon also flashed by. The beam of light lasted for about 3 to 5 seconds, and then gradually weakened. Brando pressed one hand on the sage slate and gradually stopped struggling. At the same time, he felt a mark in his heart, as if he could feel a direction. He knew that this meant that there was a connection between him and the Lionheart sword. A fantasy weapon had such an ability. Of course, there were advantages and disadvantages to this connection. The advantage was that he was one step closer to the legendary divine artifact. The disadvantage was that Brando looked at Fleetwood and Makarov, who were looking at him with unfathomable gazes. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.cheatyin.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 200. The atmosphere in the forest was a little awkward. As the chief court wizard, Fleetwood naturally understood what happened, but he did not know how to react. The reaction of the divine artifact, Martha above, stunned the scholarly old man. He had never thought of such a thing. But then again, if the other party was really a dragon, even at such a young age, it was not something that the few of them would be able to stop. But the problem was that Makarov was still raising his sword and slashing at the opponent's magic shield. Of course, it was not only them. In fact, Brando's mind was also in a mess. But after he sorted out his thoughts, he wanted to think of a way to scare these people away. In fact, after resonating with the divine artifact, Brando no longer had the mood to deal with these people. He knew that the real trouble did not lie with the group in front of him. With the laws here, they would not be able to stop him for the time being. But the real problem was that such a huge magic reaction had been recorded by countless people. Anyone with a brain would know that something good had appeared in this area. He thought that in less than half a month, Randner would be in chaos. The narrow mountains and hills were filled with exploration parties from all over the world. There were even adepts that no one liked. Martha above, he did not even dare to imagine how chaotic this place would be. Brando had thought more than once about how he would affect the history of this world for the first time. But he did not expect it to come so quickly and so suddenly, giving him no time to prepare. That was why he was no longer worried about the Lionheart sword. Instead, he was more worried about whether his precious territory near Count Randner would be affected. Furthermore, would Her Highness' actions be affected as well? Could it be that the butterfly of history flapped its wings and changed the course of history? Of course, that was the worst-case scenario, but Brando could not help but sweat when he thought of it. But what was the saying, if you want to avoid trouble, trouble will come knocking on your door. Just as Brando was thinking about this problem, the forest suddenly resounded with a clap, clap, clap. He immediately saw Fleetwood and Makarov. Fleetwood and Makarov were stunned for a moment before a trace of joy flashed across his face. They don't come with good intentions, Brando thought. He turned around just in time to see a middle-aged man wearing a thick purple velvet coat with a white shirt inside walking out of the forest. The newcomer clapped his hands and said with a smile, "So this is the Mr. Brando that the sly fox was talking about." Sure enough, heroes come from the young. Normal people wouldn't have thought of this plan. Elemental activation. The corner of Brando's eyes twitched. He had already recognized who this guy was. He liked to wear a purple windbreaker with a white silk shirt inside, and had a smile that hid a dagger behind it. The Earl of the Violet Autonomous Region, Bali Braun. This guy was the most capable assistant of Duke Lone. Compared to Buga, he was just a small guard captain. He was the real big fish in Lantern Island. Almost 40 years later, he should be around level 80 by then. Brando had dealt with this person a lot in the game in the past. He knew that the other party looked hypocritical, but in fact, he was a rare noble with a strong sense of justice. But later on, this person died in the battle with the tree herders, which was a great loss to Erwin. Brando looked at this person and could not help but twitch the corner of his mouth, but his tone was slightly gentler. Plan? Of course. Count Bar replied, as far as I know, the dragon clan is a lone wolf in almost all situations, right? At most, they move with their mates, right? This guy knows us quite well. Brando immediately heard the voice of the dragon girl, Alaz. Brando snorted, thinking that this guy was harder to deal with than he thought. You haven't dealt with him before. But he still had the mood to bicker with Alaz, but he could not help but feel guilty. Bar. Dan Danian was different from Makarov, Buga, and even Fleetwood. He was a practical person, and he definitely wouldn't try to scare him. Since he was able to deal with him so confidently, he definitely had something up his sleeve. Moreover, even if there was only one more elemental awakened master, the situation would become a little more complicated. After all, Alaz was clearly a Lolita. Although she had the advantage of being a Lolita, against two half-activated elemental masters and a gold-tier Makarov, this Lolita dragon seemed to be unable to hold her own. He could not help but glance around the forest, and suddenly thought of another question. Bar. Danton is Duke Lone's most capable assistant, and he's a nobleman with real power. If he's here, Duke Anthony wouldn't have brought his army over, would he? Brendel looked carefully and saw shadows in the forest. Holy *T, he couldn't help but cry out in his heart. There were too many people. Openly mobilizing an army into another lord's territory, could it be that Duke Lone wanted to start a war with Count Randner? But wait. Brando immediately realized that something was wrong. Duke Lone did not just want to arrange for his only son to be brought back. Thinking of this, the young man's mind suddenly flashed like a bolt of lightning. He immediately thought of the small royal territory on the other side of Randner's border. Isn't that the private territory of the princess where the cavalry academy is located? Damn! The tree herders were fooled this time. Duke Anthony was going to build one path in the open, and another path in the dark. Because he was a newbie, Brando barely experienced Erwin's civil war, so although he knew the general process and the final result of the civil war, he did not know the specific process. Now it seemed that the princess had already gathered troops from all sides. No wonder she stabilized the front line from the beginning. He was wondering how the princess could hold on for so long with her original strength, until the situation changed later on. He glanced at the cunning fox in front of him, and knew who was behind this plan. Although this guy's face was a little repulsive, his personal ability was indeed first class. Brando could not help but break out in cold sweat. He thought to himself that he was lucky, or else he might have been played around by this old fox. He cursed in his heart, and then whispered to Alaz, "Miss Alaz, why didn't you warn me just now?" He meant the army that appeared later on. The magic reaction just now was so strong that it attracted all their attention. Besides, it's just some insects, what's there to pay attention to? Oh, only the one in front of you is a little stronger. Insects. Brando thought to himself that it was an army. He did not know how many there were from here, but there were at least 1,000 people. And this was probably only a part of it. Barley had always been good at using a butcher's knife to kill chickens. He personally confessed that his biggest hobby, other than playing cards, was to fight with numbers and bully the weak. Of course, although this was just a joke, it was enough to show this person's character. Plus there are 2 supermasters with semi-activated elemental power. Lolita Miss Long, are you sure you're okay? Of course, but it's nothing. Alaz replied disdainfully. Brando did not believe it from the bottom of his heart. He thought to himself, do you think I've never seen a dragon? Although he was now an ordinary person, he had killed at least 80 dragons in the past, if not 100, so he was very clear about the other party's age and level. After thinking this through, Brando became careful. He waited to see what this Barley Danes had to say. What would Barley Danes say about this? So, the Violet Count continued, "You're not actually a dragon, right?" Ha! Brando thought to himself, how is that possible? Although he really wasn't of the dragon race, the ancient flux magic he had used before was the real deal. But his dragon magic. Makarov froze for a moment before asking. But this time, Fleetwood interrupted him and said, "If I'm not wrong, that should be the effect of the scroll, right? Since Mr. Brando can get the golden apple and the divine artifact, then getting a draconic scroll should not be a problem." Brando heard this answer and could not help but twitch the corner of his mouth. He thought to himself, "Old Fleetwood, you're the chief wizard of the court. How can you be so old that you can't even differentiate between a draconic scroll and a draconic spell?" However, he immediately remembered that Fleetwood wasn't at the age where his vision was blurry. In fact, Fleetwood hadn't even reached his peak yet. Logically speaking, he shouldn't have made such a low-level mistake. If this was not the case, then it could only be the other possibility. Brando immediately gritted his teeth and asked in his mind, "Miss Alaz, the scroll you used?" He immediately received a positive answer. "Why?" he asked. "You see, that's why they dared to attack you, isn't it?" Alaz smiled and said happily, "I haven't beaten anyone up in a long time." Brando sighed. She was right. But the problem now was that they might not be able to beat her, miss. Thinking up to this point, he decided that this problem girl was unreliable. He took a deep breath and raised his head and said, "Maybe you're right, Barley Danes. Mr. Danes. However, you can try and see how many of these spells I have, can't you?" Barley smiled and shook his head. "No matter how many scrolls you have, do you have the confidence to fight against an entire army? Mr. Brando, this is not wise, so please hand over the golden apple." Brando really wanted to punch this guy in the face and smash that fake smile of his into smithereens. But just as he was about to think of a way to retaliate, another group of people suddenly appeared from the forest. In fact, it was the shrubbery in the east that made the sound. Then, in front of everyone's eyes, there were more than 20 fully armored elven warriors bathed in blood. "Is that so? What if we join in?" Nalathar took off his helmet and looked at Count Barley with an indifferent gaze. Gold rank, silver elves, Fleetwood and Makarov could only feel the corners of their eyes twitching. Barley. Dan Dayan was also stunned and almost choked on his words. How many years has it been since he last saw a silver elf? The Violet Earl stared at the 20 or so people and finally squeezed out a sentence, "Silver elves, former allies. You're the only race that didn't participate in the Civil War. Are you going to start a war with the humans because of this person?" Nalathar nodded and looked at Brando. "I owe him a promise." "Fine," Barley sighed, "but even so, you want to fight against Duke Lone's army with just 20 elves. I admit that you're the strongest warriors, but my men," but he couldn't finish his sentence. In fact, it wasn't just him. It was as if everyone was suddenly silenced. Everyone, including Brando, saw a dazzling silver light appear in the forest, and the unicorns that the Elven Knight rode, the Him Legion. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.cheatyen.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 201. Your Highness, there are too many enemies. Please take shelter for a moment. Sir Benninger's earnest pleas came from outside. His voice was urgent, and the situation was not optimistic. Steel bolts hit the iron plates in the compartment of the carriage's side wall. Assassins were coming from all sides of the forest. Even Princess Griffin herself did not expect that in Graf's own territory, she would usher in the most dangerous assassination since she had fled. However, the young girl pursed her lips and looked straight ahead with her pale silver eyes. She replied, "No need. I will wait here for my knights to arrive." "Your Highness." "Sir Benninger." "Yes. It's nothing. Thank you," the girl said calmly. The voices outside the carriage stopped. The young man turned around and put his hand on the hilt of his sword. All that was left was the courage in his heart. As usual, the half-elf girl was wearing her favorite silver-white princess dress. Her hands were folded on her knees, and even at this moment, the girl's sitting posture was even more upright than the most meticulous young lady. The princess of Erewhon's royal family exuded the majesty of an ancient family. Even in the eyes of the strictest nobles, she was the brightest pearl on Erewhon's crown. In the eyes of the princess, the only heir to the throne of Erewhon was looking at her timidly from the opposite side of the carriage. "Sister." Haruz, the only son of King Oberg VII, whispered in fear. The girl glared at her only brother coldly. "Haruz, take your sword and turn it around." Haruz had always been obedient to his strict sister, and this time, he did not dare to disobey. He overcame his fear and carefully turned the sword around. There was a line of small words engraved on the scabbard. "Call my name Courage." This was the motto of the royal family of Covardo, and it was also the motto of the half-fairy princess. But when it came to the only son of King Oberg VII, it became a glaring irony. The little boy grabbed his sword with both hands and looked up at his sister helplessly. The latter's sternness and the danger lurking outside the carriage made him at a loss for what to do. Tears welled up in his eyes. Seeing her brother like this, even Griffin couldn't help but sigh. Her heart softened, and she said softly, "It's okay. I'm here. I'll protect you." The little boy wiped his tears with his sleeve and nodded vigorously. The carriage became quiet. The battle outside also seemed to have quieted down. In Graf's Royal Cavalry Academy, everyone on the field, in the classrooms, and in the corridors could not help but stand up and look at the strange scene outside the arched window. Freya looked up in a daze. All she could see was the silver beam that pierced through the clouds. Under the vast sky, behind the mountains, the light that connected the sky and the earth was like the Babel Tower in ancient myths. With the light as the center, the clouds slowly moved to the sky thousands of miles away, as if they were forming radiating fish-scale patterns in a wider angle. The magnificence of the scene was beyond all words in the mortal world. It could penetrate one's soul and make one tremble from the depths of one's heart. What was that? The girl was wearing the training equipment. She had one hand on her ponytail, and she was so stunned that she forgot to put it down. Her face reflected the light of the clouds as she stared in that direction. What was Lady Martha trying to tell the world? More and more people came to the training grounds of the Royal Cavalry Academy. The crowd screamed and passed information to each other as if the end of the world was coming. Everyone looked up at the sky in the south and held their breaths. The whispers of the crowd became louder and louder. The instructors who came out to maintain order quickly joined in the crowd. They shook their heads in disbelief, unable to believe what they were seeing. "This is a resonance reaction, right? What did you say?" He saw the girl who had one hand behind her head pressing down on her ponytail turn her head and stare at him with a questioning look on her face with her bright light brown eyes. Count Beckberg's second son's heart skipped a beat. This was a rare opportunity. The majority of the students in the Royal Cavalry Academy were male students. The few female students in each batch naturally became the target of these nobles. Freya, who had an outstanding appearance and temperament, was even rarer because she did not have any family background. She was called a delicious prey. This hunting game was spread among the senior students, so the prey naturally did not have any awareness. However, Freya instinctively felt that there were more and more strange people around her. This made this girl from Butchie instinctively feel nervous and uneasy. However, she could not help but take a second look at the blonde boy who answered her question. He seemed to know something. It's a type of magic reaction, but it's so strong. I've never heard of it before. The second son of Count Beckberg immediately showed his best side and replied with a smile. Magic reaction. Freya's heart skipped a beat. She inexplicably thought of a certain night in the Golden Tree Canyon. She did not know how that fellow was doing. However, she immediately turned around to prevent her burning expression from falling into the eyes of others. The girl from Butchie raised her head and stared at the silver pillar of light. The light was gradually fading. She took a deep breath and tried to calm the panic in her heart as she asked, "Where is that place?" "If it's that direction, it should be towards Ranner." Ranner. Freya could not help but place a hand on her chest. She could feel her heart beating vigorously. "Brando, is that you?" "I miss you so much." The girl's restlessness and shyness were seen by the youth as a sign that his attack was effective. What an inexperienced country girl. He could not help but think in his heart. However, he maintained a gentle smile on his face and wanted to say something else. But it was at this moment that a hurried bell rang throughout the playground, interrupting the young people's sweet talk. Everyone on the playground had to reluctantly withdraw their gazes from the strange phenomenon in the southern sky and look in another direction on the playground. The silver bell of Bosta Academy was hung on the top of the bell tower of the administration hall. It was only rung during celebrations or the most urgent situations. Thus, everyone could not help but think, what happened? Is it related to the strange phenomenon from before? But a group of cavalrymen had already entered the field from the other side. As soon as they entered, they separated the people on the field. The leader of the group was a girl wearing a purple swallow-tailed military uniform. She rode her horse in front of everyone, then turned her horse around and stopped. She raised her chin slightly and looked at everyone from each grade. "From the moment you hear this order, go to your positions. I'll give you 3 minutes to prepare for battle." The girl's voice was low and slightly hoarse, but it was like a cold wind that swept through everyone's heart, causing everyone to feel suffocated. Prepare for battle. What battle? A mock battle. But it's not the time to test it yet. Someone from the preparatory grade, what? Freya looked at the female knight with black hair that reached her waist. She stood upright on her horse like a javelin and could not help but be stunned for a moment. She heard the young man mumbling subconsciously behind her, so she turned around and asked the second son of Count Beckberg. "That woman is a student from the preparatory grade." The preparatory grade is actually equivalent to the Black Cavalry or the Imperial Guard. So, although they are called students, they are actually soldiers. That woman is called Maynard. She is the daughter of Madame Miller. Or let me put it another way, it might be easier for you to understand. Madame Miller is the sister of Duke Lone. She married a knight a few years ago. Her husband died in the 10 Years' War and has been living at home ever since. This is her only daughter. The second son of Count Beckberg replied with a serious face, "That woman is a genius of the Bosta Academy." But then again, those who can enter the preparatory grade naturally can't be compared to the useless trash like us. Maynard. Freya remembered this name. At the same time, she looked at the youth and smiled at him with some gratitude. "Don't say that. I think you're very powerful. You know so much." The second son of Count Beckberg was stunned. He saw the serious and sincere look in the girl's eyes and could not help but be slightly moved. But this feeling was only for a moment. The youth sneered in his heart and thought, "Wait till you have a taste of me, then you will know how powerful I am." Hee. Asterisk. The Silver Elven Knight stood silently in the forest, facing off against Duke Lone's private army on the other side. There was no wind in the forest. The black and silver swallow-tailed flags drooped dejectedly in their respective camps. After the clouds in the sky dispersed, the afternoon sun shone down on the forest without any reservation. It formed a solid light pillar at the edge of the treetops. These light pillars fell on the lily insignia on the flags and the bear and wolf insignia on the flags. Other than the occasional sneeze or the neighing of the warhorses, there was no other sound in the forest. It was an awkward silence. Macaro, Fleetwood, Buga, Count Bar, Nolamines, and the silver elf knight commander who was wearing a long, pointed helmet. None of them said a word. Only Brando sat calmly in the middle. He knew that Alaz was right beside him, so he was not too worried about any trouble. With Nalathar and this immature Lolita, the Violet Count shouldn't be able to think of any way to cause trouble for him. He stared at the rows of elven knights that seemed to be cloaked in silver light, guessing their intentions amidst the strange silence. The Silver Elves abided by an ancient prophecy and had not returned to the continent for centuries. Why would they appear this time? Even if it meant breaking their oath. P.S. Everyone's support will be engraved in my heart. This chapter is a gift to this friend. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 202. The strategy guide did not mention anything about this part of the story, probably because they ended it too early. Who would have thought that the Silver Elves had already appeared on the continent before the First War of the Black Rose? While he was thinking about this, he went to rummage through the corpse of the Acolyte of Earth out of boredom. The residual magic in the corpse was condensing into a crystal of high purity. This was a drop from a level 65 boss, and it also had the attribute of the blood of God. It was one of the best forging and alchemy materials of the same level, second only to the treasures of the dragon. He could not help but look at Alaz beside him. Of course, he could only see air. You have a weird look in your eyes, Mr. Brando. Is that so? But Alaz already has a mate, and I'm not interested in humans. But if it's Mr. Brando, I don't mind giving it a try once in a while. Cough, cough. Brando choked and coughed. Both sides looked at him. Count Bar turned around and looked at the Silver Elves with cold eyes. He broke the silence first. Let's negotiate. The Silver Elves nodded. In fact, the long and boring negotiation lasted until the evening. The only real participants were Bar, Fleetwood, and the Silver Elf Knight Commander. On the other side, Makarov and Buga, under Brando's instructions, helped eke out from the bushes covered in blood and reluctantly thanked him. The Silver Elves had made it clear that they wanted to protect Brando because he protected their king's tomb, so they had no choice but to lower their stance. In fact, Brando gained more than that. He felt that he had won the highest level of respect from the Silver Elves. Not only were the warriors friendly to him, the Silver Elf commander even gave him a piece of ginkgo leaf in private. Of course, Brando did not think that it was a token of love. Although it looked like a bookmark, he knew that it was not as simple as a bookmark. In fact, it was a token of friendship. In other words, if he were to be harassed in Erewhon in the future, he could take this ginkgo leaf and seek political asylum. Of course, this was just a joke. This ginkgo leaf represented that the Silver Elves owed him a favor. As long as he or his descendants carried this ginkgo leaf, they would be able to obtain a chance to ask for help from the Silver Elves. Brando did not know what the request for help was. He only knew that in his previous life, someone had used this item to rent more than 100 heavy elven infantry from the Silver Elves. The term of the loan was 100 years. Although they were not as rare as the Phoenix Guards, they were still one of the best troops on the continent. However, even though Brando was itching to give it a try, his rationality told him that it was unwise to be impatient. After all, this was the real world and not a game. Building a good relationship with the Silver Elves would be beneficial in the future. If he were to appear impatient from the start, wouldn't this noble and cold race look down on him? Wouldn't that be a loss? Even though the Violet Earl looked at the scene with a solemn expression, he knew that he could not allow his subordinates to fight the Silver Elves here. The reputation of the Sacredham Legion was once known throughout the continent. Even after 7 centuries, no one dared to challenge them. After comparing the strengths of both sides, the Violet Earl made a wise choice. After both sides left the neutral zone, they returned to their respective camps and ordered their troops to turn around and retreat 300 meters. Only then did the atmosphere in the forest calm down. Brendel sat beside the acolyte of Earth's corpse and looked at the scene with surprise. Even though he did not participate in the negotiations, he knew that the core of the negotiations was about why the Silver Elves had reappeared after hundreds of years of disappearance. Even though this area used to be part of the Elven Empire, it was given up by the Elven Empire. Thus, the Eruin Empire had the right to declare their sovereignty. Today, after 200 or 300 years, this area had become part of the Elven Empire's territory. Even the closest allies of the Elven Empire could not casually step into this area. However, Brando could see that the Silver Elves were extremely stubborn. He did not know what kind of agreement was reached between the two sides that made Bali and Fleetwood accept it. "Why do you think the Silver Elves returned to the continent?" he suddenly asked. The dragon girl Allah's nonchalant voice rang out. "How would I know about those weird fellows? They don't interact with outsiders." "Ayaya, don't disturb other people's business." Allah's voice suddenly complained. "Business?" Of course, Allah's voice sounded proud. "I'm writing a script about the Knight Brando. It took me a while to get the idea. Oh right, I forgot to mention to Mr. Brando that my profession is a poet." "Poet?" Brendel's brows furrowed as he listened. It seemed that the profession of a poet was extremely popular among the dragon race. He remembered a very famous plot in the game. There was a giant dragon that created a huge underground city, and then captured a few powerful monsters and placed them in there, turning them into bosses and other monsters. Then, it let the players who did not know enter the challenge. It recorded the results of the challenge and then wrote a story. Of course, those who actually defeated the boss would be able to obtain a treasure. This treasure was actually a very small part of the dragon's collection. In fact, it was later proven that it was not even 1/10 of the profits it obtained from each story. He remembered that the dungeon was a level 45 dungeon. At first, the players thought that it was just a normal dungeon. But later on, the inside story was discovered, and it became a popular story. But the dragon race's bad taste was also evident. Of course, in comparison, this giant dragon at least got rich through labor. Compared to some unscrupulous robbers, it was much better. Of course. The dragon girl seemed to be proud, but suddenly her tone changed. "Don't bother me, it's so annoying." "Forget it, I'll go write it myself." After she finished speaking, Brando heard the voice beside him go silent. "Tisk," he could not help but sneer. But at this time, he suddenly heard a click behind him. The young man thought that Alaz had returned so quickly. But when he turned around, he saw Nalathar standing there. At this moment, the former commander of the Phoenix Guards had taken off his helmet. He looked at Brando seriously, and then at the corpse of the giant beast beside the young man. A trace of doubt flashed in his silver eyes. Brando was stunned. But then he smiled and suddenly said, "I think, Nalathar." Nalathar looked at him and was slightly startled. "It's better if you wear the helmet." "Why?" the silver elf asked indifferently. "You're too handsome, I'm a bit stressed." The young man sighed. For the first time, Nalathar could not help but smile. He thought about it seriously, and really did put the helmet back on. Only a pair of silver eyes were left on Brando. But Nalathar paused for a moment and said, "I'm leaving, Brando." Brando was slightly startled. He had never thought about this before. But wasn't this inevitable? The mission was over, and Nalathar should of course return. He suddenly wanted to say something, but the words were stuck in his throat. The scenes of fighting side by side with Nalathar for the past few days replayed in his mind. Although there were no unnecessary words, but the sense of trust that came from the bottom of his heart grew. He looked at Nalathar and lowered his head. Where would Nalathar go after he returned? The Silver Elf King's tomb, or the altar? The power of Shay's altar was weakening by the day. Although he said that he would return one day to bring Nalathar news to the outside world, who knew if they would ever meet again? Perhaps it would be like a real storyline mission, and he would only meet Nalathar once. When he returned, there would only be a lonely altar left in the forest of Chablis. Brando knew that this was very likely. He wanted to say something, but his heart suddenly felt empty. It was so empty that he could not say anything. The young man hesitated for a long time and said heartlessly, "You're leaving, Nalathar. But you haven't done what you promised me. Don't tell me you don't want to go back on your word." The Silver Elf commander snickered. "Going back on my word? You humans invented a good word. Of course, I'll do it." As he spoke, he took out a scroll and handed it to Brando. Nalathar hesitated for a moment and replied softly, "My thoughts are written on it, my friend." Those words struck Brando like a bolt of lightning, and he stood there without moving for a long time. Nalathar smiled and handed the scroll back to Brando, then leaned forward and hugged him. "Thank you for bringing us to a battle that I haven't seen for a long time. My blood is boiling again. You're very good, and the battle was exciting, but all good things must come to an end. Also, you owe me a promise," the Silver Elf commander whispered. "Remember to tell me what happened outside, decades, 100 years. Don't go back on your word, my friend. Is that how you say it?" He struggled to pronounce the word "go back on your word" in Kurlutz, then asked with a smile. "Yes." Brando raised his hand and rubbed his eyes. "The wind is a little strong." Nalathar nodded in understanding, and his body slowly disappeared into the air. Only his final smile was left, but it was also fading away. The heroic spirits of the 20 elven warriors turned into white light and soared into the sky, disappearing into a distant place in the southern forest. Everyone saw this scene, but only the Silver Elves, Olaz, and Brando knew what really happened. The young man saw the Silver Elf Knight commander nodding kindly at him from afar, as if he was comforting him. Brando felt a little relieved, and felt a little better. Indeed, Nalathar was right. All good things must come to an end. Isn't that right? To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidien.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 203. Brando finally calmed himself down, but when he raised his head again, he was surprised to see Count Bar standing in front of him. "What is this guy trying to do? You're Mr. Brendel, right?" The Violet Count's smile disappeared as he asked seriously. "What's wrong?" Brando asked in a bad mood. "Even though we have different opinions, we seem to be on the same side. At least I can be sure that you are not on our side, right?" Before Brando could reply, the Violet Count continued, "Of course, we all have our own way of reviving the kingdom, but there is no need to hate each other. I admit that Mr. Makarov's way of doing things is a little extreme, but he is only a mortal. What are you trying to say? Are you willing to join our side? Rather than complaining, why don't you do it yourself? I hope to see an excellent young man like you on our side." Bar seemed to have forgotten his previous unhappiness and sincerely invited Brendel. "This is in line with your usual style," Brando thought. But he shook his head. "Nonsense. If it weren't for the fact that we're on the same side, you wouldn't even have the chance to stand here and talk. Brando knew that with Allah's help and Scarlet's ginkgo leaf, it was only a matter of minutes for him to keep this army here. But he didn't want to be too harsh on them. He had already taught Makarov and Fleetwood a lesson with Scarlet and Sanford, but if he took another step forward, there would be a conflict between the two sides. Brando wasn't a reckless young man who couldn't see the situation clearly. He knew that if he kept Duke Lone's army here, the princess's side would be invaded by Arek's army. If things went wrong, even Freya would be in danger, not to mention the future. Since Bar was wise enough not to continue the topic of the golden apple, Brendel didn't want to talk about it anymore. What a joke. No, Brendel shook his head and replied coldly, "You will see me very soon. Trust me, but not here, and not in your one-sided way." He rejected him firmly, but his next words made Bali pause for a moment. "You will see me very soon. Trust me, but not here, and not in your one-sided way." The Violet Count listened to Brendel's words with a complicated expression, and then he looked at Brendel deeply. "I'll wait and see," he answered thus. The real battle was led by the senior knight students under the leadership of the reserve officers. When the junior freshmen like Freya arrived, they were only responsible for cleaning up the battlefield. Like the others, when she arrived at the battlefield, she saw the hedgehog-like carriage in the middle of the forest from afar. A row of knights in silver armor surrounded the carriage. There were many corpses of their companions around the knights, but even so, they did not allow anyone to get close to the carriage. They insisted on treating the wounds of the dead and their companions. As a result, the battlefield was clearly divided into two colors, silver and purple. Neither interfered with each other. There were corpses everywhere on the road and in the forest. Occasionally, there would be mournful wails from far and near, or the screams of nobles' daughters and sons. In fact, when the senior students passed by the battlefield, they did not kill everyone. Some of them even deliberately left a lot of seriously injured people behind. But except for the necessary survivors, the rest of the people had to become cold corpses. This job was left to the freshmen who cleaned up the battlefield. Many of them were too scared to do it. Some even felt disgusted. Young people like Freya, who was promoted from the guards and the militia, were much better. She just guessed the identity of the person in the carriage and then buried her head in her own work. Count Beckberg's second son followed behind him with a pale face. He had vomited all the things he wanted to vomit. Now, the young man could only retch. He held onto a fir tree as he looked at Freya's clean and efficient actions with admiration. She really is a girl with character. Do you know who that is? He gasped for breath and asked. What? Freya didn't understand and turned around to ask. A carriage. The girl from the countryside of Butchie looked at the carriage in confusion. Her bright eyes showed her confusion as she shook her head. The emblem on the carriage is a sacred beetle. It only belongs to one person in the kingdom. The young man looked at Freya in surprise. How did she come to the Royal Academy if she didn't even know this? However, he soon realized that she was not pretending to be so innocent. He shook his head and replied, Grand Master Fleetwood, the chief court magus of Erewhon. Ah! The girl was shocked. Count Beckberg's second son shook his head again, but if Grand Master Fleetwood is in the carriage, we don't even need to do anything. Therefore, the person in the carriage could be someone else. However, there aren't many people close to Grand Master Fleetwood. Other than the king, only his students can borrow his carriage. Your Highness. Freya couldn't help but stare with wide eyes. Although she was just a country girl, she still understood this common knowledge. The young man nodded. However, as the two were talking, a black warhorse suddenly swept past them. The knight on the horse quickly passed through the forest, but seemed to be stunned for a moment. He turned his horse around and came to a stop in front of them. Freya was slightly startled. She subconsciously raised her head with the young man beside her and saw a beautiful but cold face. The head on the snow-white neck was like an exquisite work of art. Even in the north of Corvado, it was difficult to see such a perfect face. The sharp chin had an arc as if it had just walked out of a painting. It made people think that the so-called beauties of the north that were praised in the bard's poems might have been born from this. The girl's eyes were like a pair of cold amethysts. The people of the north more or less had the blood of the Myernas, but it was rare to see such pure blood. Her lips were tightly pursed, and her thin eyebrows under her bangs were slightly raised. Then, she frowned with dissatisfaction, giving people a feeling that she didn't like to smile. Her straight and slender nose seemed to represent the girl's extremely strong character. But at this moment, she only let out a soft snort. She looked down at the two people, her eyes slowly sweeping over Freya and falling on the second son of Count Beckberg. "You're Freya." She stared at the second son of Count Beckberg, making the latter feel as if he was a poisonous snake in the grass that was locked on by the sharp eyes of a falcon. But when Maynard spoke, his low, cold, and slightly hoarse voice was asking Freya. "Why yes. Your results in horsemanship and swordsmanship training are very good," Maynard said with a low and magnetic voice. "I've heard about you, but if you want to achieve your wish, it's best to stay away from these scum." The girl rode on her horse and looked back at the young man with a disdainful gaze, speaking bluntly. Both of them were stunned. The second son of Count Beckberg frowned and subconsciously retorted, "Senior Maynard, if you say that," but before he could finish his words, he heard a soft clang, and then he felt a slight chill on his neck. Just as the corner of his eyes saw the cold reflection on the snow-white blade, the young man realized that Maynard had already dismounted from her horse, unsheathed her long sword, and placed it on his neck. The whole action was done in one breath, and even his hands froze when he made a gesture of spreading out his hands. "Did I allow you to interrupt?" Maynard asked coldly. The young man's back was drenched in cold sweat, and he couldn't say a word for a moment. "What's your name?" the girl asked again. Sangini, soldier rank." "N.I., Maynard, I." The girl's sword came closer and interrupted him, reporting to Sir. The second son of Count Beckberg swallowed his saliva and replied in a trembling voice, "Sir, I'm a second-year student. I haven't reached the rank of sergeant yet." He almost didn't dare to say another word, and used all his strength to force the words out of his mouth. Maynard sheathed her sword with a clang, so fast that almost no one saw it clearly. She turned around and looked coldly at the young man who was touching his neck and cursing loudly in his heart. Her purple eyes were filled with undisguised disdain, but when she opened her mouth, it was an unquestionable order. "Then, soldier, I order you to shut up." Then she turned around and adjusted Freya's collar, which was a little crooked from cleaning up the battlefield, and then she patted her shoulder and said softly, "Remember what I said, it won't hurt you." Freya didn't move, and for a moment she didn't know what to say. Should I say thank you? But if she's really so powerful, will I become someone like her? One day. She couldn't help but think so. Who is that? When the half-fairy princess turned around, she whispered to the young man beside her. Her gaze passed through the window of the carriage and fell on the side of the forest. The whole process of the conflict between the second son of Count Beckberg and Maynard fell into this girl's eyes. She pulled open the curtain with one hand and looked at the two girls in the forest in a daze, feeling a trace of familiarity in her heart. Madame Miller's daughter, or rather, she's related to Duke Lone. Her talent is not bad, and she's also a die-hard supporter of the royal family, so she should be trustworthy. Sir Benninger only took a glance and replied. Hearing the young man's silly look, the girl couldn't help but smile. "Of course I know Maynard, she's my close friend." "Benninger, are you too tired?" "I'm sorry." Benninger replied awkwardly. "I'm talking about the other one, do you know her?" The half-fairy princess asked again. "I think she's a little familiar, that's Everton's daughter." A gentle voice came from outside the carriage. Griffine was slightly startled, and then a trace of surprise flashed in her pale silver eyes. She turned around and asked in a low voice, "Lord Oberway?" There was a moment of silence outside the carriage. Then there was a low laugh. "That's me, Your Highness. It seems that I'm a little late." To be continued. If you want to know the future, please go to www.cheedian.com. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 204. Living in the vast highlands to the north of Aween, the Gurch tribe had a well-known legend. Legend had it that the lone soldier on the battlefield was the one favored by the god of death. Vain. Nostar had also heard of this legend before. He was a knight recruited from the Balta region in the north of the kingdom. He came from a noble family and had some skills in taming beasts before he joined the army. After joining the army, he naturally became a Wyvern Knight and was part of the 34th Regiment's Wyvern Cavalry Squadron. This army was originally part of the kingdom's southern army, but the latter had long been scattered by Madara's undead army in this war. Even their commander, Count Bainag, had died. Nasida's unit waited for a long time, but there were no signs of a ceasefire. Instead, the undead of Madara were getting stronger by the day, and the nobles behind them used the excuse that the negotiations had come to an end and the war had ended as an excuse to not provide them with any support. The messengers sent to contact the White Mane Army and Erek were nowhere to be found, and the situation was getting worse by the day. Baron Kellan, the supreme commander of the 34th Regiment at the southern border of Randner, wrote in his diary, "The situation in the south is getting worse by the day. We don't know where our brothers are scattered, and the undead of Madara are attacking from all directions. We can't contact anyone, and the news seems to have been cut off. Even retreating has become impossible. The nobles are doing what they want, and today, this territory is out of the control of the kingdom. Martha above, may I live to see the end of this nightmare," but to Vane. None of this was important to Nosidia. He and his wyvern were shot down while patrolling a human village that was destroyed by the undead, and became the legendary person of the Gurch tribe who was targeted by the Grim Reaper's cold gaze. He raised his head with a face full of blood, and saw in despair rows and rows of skeleton warriors coming from all directions from the ruins of the village. He was pinned down by the wyvern's corpse, and the light crossbow in his hand was the only weapon he had to protect himself. He raised his arm and shot an arrow at one of the skeletons. The crossbow that had been blessed by the holy water exploded with a dazzling light, and a skeleton turned into ashes in the white light. But after a series of white lights, even more undead creatures drowned out Nosidar's vision. An endless feeling of dejection shrouded the young man. That was a few months ago, Nosidar could not help but think. When they heard that Madara had split into 3 groups to invade the kingdom, be it the soldiers or the nobles, almost everyone held a relaxed attitude as they waited to see how these backward and barbaric Dark Lords would fall apart due to infighting and disagreements in command, just like every other joint invasion in history. But the final result was out of everyone's expectations. Madara's army was decisive, calm, and effective. In comparison, the kingdom of Erewhon was more like an old man past his prime, unable to withstand the attacks and showing signs of fatigue. The kingdom's former glory was long gone. 3 centuries ago, the 17th Archbishop of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, called the Blade of Flames, the model of ancient glory, only existed in the history of the past. After shooting the last arrow, the young man calmly threw away the crossbow, and tightly held the necklace with his wife's name on it with one hand. He looked up, and a tall skeleton had blocked the sun above his head. The fiery red soul fire in his eyes danced. "Farewell, father, mother, and dear Vanessa. I only hope that you can remember your son and husband and many others who fought in this place to protect Erewhon, but there is no hope for this kingdom." After October, the smell of autumn gradually became stronger, and the plains along the coast of Tonajul were dyed with a layer of pale yellow. Just by riding on the road between the countryside, Brando and the rest could already feel the obvious smell of war. After the leather armor was torn apart by Allahs, Brando simply found a tailor in a town along the way and ordered a set of long black windbreaker and breeches, putting on the airs of a lord. He sat up straight on the horse and looked around, wearing a pair of eye-catching white gloves and a silver-plated long sword at his waist, looking somewhat like a young noble. But this was not because he wanted to indulge in the feeling of being a noble, but because it was easier to avoid trouble. After leaving the hills of Chablis, the month of travel became more and more boring. Although the law and order had collapsed, the bandits around the town were mostly farmers who could not make a living. On the other hand, Brando's group of 20 people was well equipped, like the children of a noble. These people who were forced into desperation due to poverty would not easily provoke them. But Brando could not help but sigh when he saw the empty farms along the way. In fact, on the day of Chablis, the dragon girl Allahs had warned him that an undead army from Madara was currently entrenched in the south of Tonajol. This news coincided with the history Brando knew. In history, Black Knight Enrich did not leave Tonajol even after half a year of the armistice because he was hungry for more. Furthermore, the ancient kingdom did not have the time to care about other things at this moment. It was close to the end of the month of autumn, October, and in the other history Brando knew, the upper echelons of the ancient kingdom were beginning to stir. According to what he knew, the support behind Oberg's eldest son, Hamel, came from Queen Anna's forces. Anna was the sister of Duke Cypher, and her ascension to the throne represented the beginning of the restoration of the Cypher dynasty. The royal faction members who supported House Corvado had different views on this matter. Furthermore, she had an ambiguous relationship with Marquis Kluge, and they even worked together to imprison the king. In history, at the beginning of the 11th month, Hamel suddenly announced his coronation, and this event officially opened the curtains of the internal division of the royal faction. Princess Griffine, who had a strong personality, naturally would not silently accept it. She immediately announced to all the nobles and knights in her own territory that Hamel's throne was not legitimate. Those who supported her were naturally the core members of the royal faction who were already dissatisfied with the queen and the elven faction that she represented. At the end of the 11th month, Duke Erek announced his support for Hamel. At the same time, the various regions started to become independent or sided with one another, and Erewhon's civil war began. From then on, until 2 years later, this civil war completely shook the foundation of the kingdom. Although the kingdom experienced a short period of prosperity after that, the kingdom had lost its new blood and was unable to be reborn from the fire. It could be said that Erewhon's destruction accelerated from this moment onwards. At this critical juncture, no one cared about what the Black Knight Enrich was doing in the south. However, that didn't mean that the impact didn't exist. The entire village in this area had migrated, leaving behind a desolate area. When they passed through the empty and silent villages, they could feel a clear sense of desolation. But as they headed south, this sense of desolation gradually changed. As they were nearing the heart of Tonajol, Abes, the road finally started to become more lively. The ruler of Tonajol was Count Randner's third son, Baron Grodin. Brando was not unfamiliar with this name, but he was not familiar with it either. In this era, most nobles were cold and opinionated, but the ruler was different. Apart from sharing a noble's face, he was also harsh, cruel, and exploited his subjects even more. Brando and the rest had already noticed this when they entered Abes. Or rather, they did not have much hope before this, but their expectations were lowered by a lot. The first thing that caught their eyes were the citizens living outside of Ferber. Only the truly poor and lowly would live outside the city without any protection. Generally speaking, they were either farmers working outside the city or refugees fleeing for their lives. On both sides of the street, there were only crumbling and dirty thatched huts. Men and women were scantily clad, and their faces were sallow and emaciated. Their eyes were dim, and there was no hope for the future. Dust was everywhere on the street, and the dry air was filled with the smell of animal dung. Compared to this place, even the dogmatic, slow, and self-righteous nobles and bureaucrats in Bruglaw seemed cute. At least in those places, although the status of the citizens was low, at least they could still survive. However, just like the naturally mean people born from barren land, the more barren the land, the more they demanded. Brando knew that the reason for this difference was not because the nobles of Grenoires were more humane, but because the land in Tonagel was more barren, and the people naturally could not tolerate it. Amandina, who was once a noble's daughter, could not help but cover her mouth in disbelief. "My lord, the territory you want to inherit is in this place." She could not help but ask with a little disappointment. She originally thought that after leaving the Highlander Dominion, the eastern coast of Tonagel would be a prosperous place. Being close to the sea meant that trade was flourishing, and flourishing trade meant wealth. Even if it was not as good as Ampere Seal, it should be comparable to Bragg's, right? She did not expect that it would be such a bleak scene. Brando was also stunned. Because he did not tell Amandina that the mercenaries of Lopez were actually his summoned creatures, he caused her to be sad for nothing and blamed himself for it. Naturally, he would be punished for it. For at least a month after Chablis, Amandina spoke to him in a businesslike manner. She no longer treated him with a friendly expression, and most of the time, she would just roll her eyes at him. Even though she always considered herself as his aide, Brando felt that this was not the attitude that a retainer should have when talking to their lord. Of course, he would not bring it up. Using his status as a noble to pressure a weak girl was something that he would not do even if he was half a modern person. If you don't have a monthly ticket, a recommendation ticket is also fine. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author and support the original reading. Translator, Endless Fantasy Translation Editor, Endless Fantasy Translation, Endless Fantasy Translation. Chapter 205. You're willing to talk to me now? He asked. Brando glanced at the refugees and did not find her question strange. In this place, even life itself was so fragile that it was worthless. Amandina would never have thought that you could get a boy for the price of a sheep. If it was a girl, the price would be even lower. With a little bit of power, you could trample on the existence of others. Bandits and lords were both killing people, the only difference was that one was outside the city, while the other was inside the city. Even if you killed someone on the streets, you would only need to compensate the local lord with a little money. In fact, he might even want you to kill a few more people. In the eyes of some lords, real gold coins were much more attractive than those who needed money to feed. Amandina was slightly surprised. She thought that Brando was dissatisfied with her previous performance, and although she felt wronged, she still lowered her head and replied. "I'm sorry. My lord, I was too stubborn." Brando spread out his hands. "You misunderstood, I never blamed you, Miss Amandina." Amandina raised her head and looked at him, as if to confirm the truth of his words. But then she lowered her head again and did not say a word. "If it's our territory, we need to go further south." Brendel replied. "South?" Amandina was really stunned. "Once we leave Tonagel, we'll be in the wilderness." "Have you heard of the Pioneer Knight, Amandina?" Brando asked. Ah, Amandina could not help but cry out. How could she not know this? Those young nobles who did not have a territory to inherit, the knight, obtained the right to expand the territory of the kingdom from the Holy Cathedral of Fire, and brought a few squires to the wilderness to open up a new territory with their own strength. This kind of story sounded like a fairy tale from the past. But she never thought that this kind of legend would actually happen to her. At first, she felt a little flustered. After all, opening up a territory in the wilderness sounded good, but in reality, it was an extremely dangerous thing. This kind of laborious and unrewarding thing had not been done in Erewhon for 100 or 200 years, so at this moment, it sounded a little bit like a fantasy story. But she immediately calmed down. So what if it was dangerous? Compared to her old house in Brugloss that was on the verge of collapse and living a life that was similar to these people's, there was at least a glimmer of hope for the latter. She could not help but look at Brando again. The title of the pioneer knight in Erewhon sounded like a classical hero, full of the spirit of enterprise. Even though it was dangerous, it was romantic. Not to mention that no matter what aspect, this lord met the ideal in her heart. It was a pity that he already had someone he liked. Amandina lowered her eyelashes, she could not help but feel a little moved. She then looked at the Roman beside her. This merchant lady had a bad record of wandering around in dangerous battlefields twice, and had been thoroughly taught a lesson by Brando. She was still well behaved at the moment. But at this moment, her eyes were focused on another side, and she spoke to the youth beside her in a crisp voice, "Brando, look over there." This young lady seemed to have a natural ability to attract people's attention, causing Amandina and Brando to turn their heads at the same time and look in the direction she was pointing at. There were many foreign travelers on the streets, just like them. In fact, ever since Brando's earth-shattering divine artifact reaction last month, the news that a divine artifact had appeared in Count Randner's taverns and inns had spread like wildfire. Wandering bards brought this news to the north, and adventurers who wanted to try their luck flocked to this place. Mercenaries, adventurers, and even bounty hunters who heard the news were like hyenas or sharks that smelled blood. They had already packed up and gathered here. Even the Council of Stars and Moon and the Black Tower had sent out scouts. Even though the nobles were enthusiastic about Erewhon's impending storm, they still sent out their own spies, and in a short period of time, Count Randner's territory was a step ahead of Graf, Princess Regent's territory. In just half a month, the number of people in this area had at least doubled. This was because Tonagel was constantly facing the threat of war, and there was a certain degree of risk involved. If not, this place would definitely be a paradise for adventurers. If it was a more peaceful time, the local lords would definitely be smiling from ear to ear. But now, the situation had become somewhat complicated. Brando's gaze swept across these people one by one, as if his identity as a noble was completely different from these people. These adventurers were also out of place with the locals around them. They stood in the middle of the street, as if there were three different worlds existing on the street at the same time. It felt as if three different types of people were depicted in the same painting using three completely different styles of expression. Their movements were distinct. The adventurers and the locals had nothing to do with each other, and the locals were not willing to provoke these lawless people. At least, most of them were. But the part that the Roman pointed out was an exception. Brando could see a small group of adventurers distributing food to the skinny local children. This scene made him feel as if time had reversed, as if he had returned to the world of the Amber Sword, and the players who were overly sympathetic back then were doing the same thing. But he quickly shook his head and threw away this unrealistic fantasy. Even though most adventurers were mercenaries, there were still some young people who went out to adventure for their dreams. Just like the 4 men and 2 women in front of him. Young people indeed. Brando couldn't help but think. Adventuring was actually not as romantic and full of swords as mentioned in bedtime stories. Of course, it was not a lie to say that it was full of swords and blades. However, the life of an adventurer was actually harsh and bloody, and they often had to go to those dangerous places. Just like mercenaries, life and death were very common. And compared to the risks, the benefits were pitifully low. Although there was no shortage of people who became rich overnight, most of them without exception ended up as a pile of bones in some unknown place. Because of this, most adventurers had to become practical and mercenary. And only young people would act with unrealistic ideals. Brando could even speculate that these young people might not have really started their travels for long. Otherwise, they might as well be the descendants of wealthy merchants or nobles. But he first turned around and asked, "What are you looking at?" But then he saw the beautiful dark brown gem-like eyes of the merchant lady turn around, as if a creative idea had been born, and he felt that something was wrong. "What do you want to do?" Brando couldn't help but ask a little warily. The little Roman's extraordinary way of doing things made him involuntarily vigilant. "That's it," the Roman answered matter-of-factly. "Romaine, we don't have much food left." Amandina seemed to understand Romaine's thoughts in an instant and reminded her in a low voice, "We have so many people and horses, so our consumption is not a small amount. If we want to buy so much food from the local area, we have to deal with the local lord. Did you forget last time?" Amandina was talking about when they passed by a small noble's territory not too long ago. Brando went to buy food from the noble, but the noble took a fancy to Scarlet and sent his personal guards to kidnap her that night. Although the 30 iron-rank personal guards overestimated their abilities in front of Brando, and in the end they were completely defeated by the young man, and they were also ruthlessly extorted, this incident was a wake-up call to everyone. Even though the kingdom had yet to collapse, the local lords were already acting without restraint. Hearing Amandina's words, Brando couldn't help but look at the girl with a touched expression. The last time it was still fine because it was a nameless noble, but this time it was Baron Grodin. Even though this fellow was not worth mentioning in Erwin's history, his father, Count Randner, was not an ordinary person. If he brought his men today, it would be a scene of the Count's army chasing after him tomorrow. He even suspected that Duke Lone's army could come and go as they pleased in Count Randner's territory. Perhaps the princess faction of the royal faction had some sort of agreement with Count Randner himself. At the very least, there was no lack of secret alliances. Of course, he would have to deal with these vampires one by one sooner or later, but that would have to wait until he was fully grown and had the right to speak. Even though it was not pleasant to hear, strength was still one of the most important laws in this world. Unexpectedly, the Roman shook her head happily after hearing Amandina's words. She said with a mysterious expression, "Brando, Amandina, didn't you notice?" "What did you notice?" "The way to do business, huh?" Brando couldn't help but touch the girl's flat forehead. "Is she having a fever?" The younger of the wild elementalist sisters widened her eyes and asked curiously, "There's a saying in my hometown, merchants do not walk with poverty. Miss Roman, is there a business opportunity in such a poor place?" "Tia." The elder sister, Falerne, glared at her sternly. The elven girl was so frightened that she stuck out her tongue and swallowed the rest of her words. However, the Roman did not care about the girl's rebuttal and replied as if it was a matter of fact, "You can't say that. My aunt said that if there's a place for trade, there's a place for merchants." "That's true." Amandina shook her head. She knew that Tia was not wrong. Not only was this place poor, but it was also backward and isolated. There were no special products, and there wasn't even a road for carriages to pass through. Business was just a very distant term. But this place even lacks the necessary conditions for trade. "Is that so? But isn't that a trade?" Amandina looked at the actions of the group of young adventurers and asked with interest. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.